I adjusted the oxygen levels in the minnow for the third time since our descent began. The system wasn't malfunctioning. I just needed something to do with my hands. 15 minutes into our dive, and the familiar weight of the deep ocean pressed against our submersible hull. A constant reminder of the crushing pressure waiting to exploit any weakness. "How's our descent rate looking?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the monitoring equipment. Amelia glanced at her screen. "Steady, at 18 meters per minute. We're at 270 now." "Perfect." I checked our trajectory on the navigation system. The darkness outside our viewport had changed from navy blue to an impenetrable black. Our external lights cut through it, illuminating particles floating in the water. Organic matter, sediment, the usual oceanic snow that rained down continuously, except there was less of it than there should have been. Much less. That was why we were here. The dead zone in the Pacific Ocean had been expanding for the past 16 months. What started as a localized anomaly had grown to cover nearly 200 kilometers. No fish, no crustaceans, barely any plankton, nothing alive. At least nothing we could detect from surface surveys. "Ben, take a look at these oxygen readings," Amelia said, tapping her screen. "They've dropped another 2% since we passed 300 mi." I pulled up the data on my display. That tracks with what the ROV recorded last week. The question is why a dead zone this size would suddenly appear with no apparent cause. "The research community isn't exactly short on theories," Amelia replied, adjusting her glasses as she always did when thinking out loud. "Pollution, runoff, climate change effects, unknown pathogens. And yet none of those explain the speed of expansion or the distinct boundaries." I kept my eyes on the chemical composition readings that scrolled across my screen. A natural oceanic dead zone develops gradually with fuzzy edges where life gradually diminishes. This one appeared suddenly and has defined borders. Almost like what?" Amelia asked when I didn't finish. "Like it was deliberately created," I shook my head. "Which makes no sense unless we're looking at some kind of massive industrial accident that nobody's reported." The submersible continued its descent, the hull occasionally creaking as the pressure increased. I'd been down in the minnow dozens of times over the past 5 years, but never to investigate something this bizarre. Dead zones weren't uncommon in the world's oceans, areas where oxygen levels dropped too low to support most marine life. But they typically formed near coastlines where agricultural runoff created algal blooms that depleted oxygen as they decomposed. This dead zone was different. It sat far from shore in deep water with no apparent trigger mechanism. "Look at this," I said, noticing an anomaly in our water analysis. "I'm getting unusual readings on elements that shouldn't be present in these concentrations. Sulfur compounds, methane. Wait, there's more." I expanded the display, focusing on the mass spectrometer data. The chemical signature was distinctive, but not immediately identifiable to me. Amelia leaned over to see my screen. "That looks volcanic." "Volcanic?" "We're not near any known hydrothermal vents." I pulled up our location map to double-check. "Not active vents on record." "Oh," Amelia said. "But remember what Blake told us last month? His team detected minor seismic anomalies in this region. Nothing major, but consistent with deep seabed activity." "Blake Carroll from geology?" I asked, trying to recall the conversation. "Yes. He mentioned it during the cross-departmental briefing. You were half asleep in the back row." She gave me a knowing look. I wasn't sleeping. I was contemplating with my eyes closed. I smiled despite the tension of the dive. "But you're right. I do remember him saying something about isolated seismic events." The depth gauge read 380 m. Now in the beam of our external lights, I saw nothing but empty water. No fish darting away from our lights. No jellyfish pulsing in the currents. The absence of life felt wrong, like walking through a forest with no birds or insects. "If there is volcanic activity, it would explain some of this," I said, thinking out loud. Underwater volcanic events can release enough hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide to create localized dead zones, but nothing on this scale without a major eruption, which would have been detected by Pacific monitoring stations. "Unless it's releasing slowly from multiple points," Amelia suggested. Blake's team mapped several potential weak spots in the ocean floor in this region. I made a mental note to talk with Blake when we returned to the surface. If his geological surveys aligned with our chemical findings, we might have the beginning of an explanation. We're approaching 500 mi, Amelia announced. Visibility is getting worse. She was right. The water outside had taken on a hazy quality despite our powerful lights. It wasn't the normal particulate matter you'd expect at this depth. This was different, almost like a thin fog. I reached for the radio. "Surface vessel, this is Minnow. Do you copy?" After a brief crackle of static, Grayson's voice came through. "Reading you 5 by 5, Minnow. How's it looking down there?" We've reached 500 meters and continuing descent. Visibility is reduced but manageable. We're seeing significant chemical anomalies consistent with potential volcanic seepage. No visible marine life so far. "Copy that," Grayson replied. "Weather's holding steady up here. You've got a 4-hour window before our next weather system moves in." "Understood. We'll be back within 4 hours. Minnow out." I set the radio down and turned to Amelia. "Let's push to 700 meters. That should put us near the center of the dead zone according to the satellite mapping." Amelia nodded, making adjustments to our ballast system. "Are we collecting water samples at intervals?" "Yes, every 50 m. The automated system is handling it." I checked the sample collection log to confirm everything was working properly. Once we reach the target depth, we'll deploy the manipulator arms for sediment collection. As we descended further, the strangeness of our surroundings became more pronounced. The water developed a faint yellowish tint that our lights couldn't fully penetrate. The temperature readings were slightly elevated for this depth. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. "Ben, what do you make of this?" Amelia pointed to her monitor, which displayed the external camera feed scanning the ocean floor as it came into view. I leaned closer to look. The seabed was visible now, roughly 50 meters below us. But instead of the rich topography I expected, the mixture of rock formations, sediment mounds, and the occasional sign of benthic life, it appeared barren, almost flat, like an underwater desert. "That's not right," I said, frowning at the image. "The bathymetric surveys showed varied terrain in this area. Could it be covered in some kind of sediment layer?" Amelia suggested. "Possibly. Let's get closer and find out." I adjusted our trajectory, bringing us down at a gentler angle as we approached the ocean floor. At 20 meters above the bottom, I stabilized our position. The scene below us was even more unsettling up close. A fine layer of what appeared to be pale sediment covered everything, smoothing out the natural contours of the seabed. It reminded me of ash covering a landscape after a volcanic eruption, except underwater. "I'm going to collect a sample," I said, activating the submersible's manipulator arms. The mechanical limbs extended from the Minnow's hull, reaching toward the seafloor with mechanical precision. I guided the primary arm to the surface, watching through the camera as the claw descended into the pale sediment. The material billowed up in clouds as the manipulator made contact, temporarily obscuring our view. "Collecting sample now," I narrated, closing the claw around a portion of the material and guiding it to the external collection chamber. "Looks like fine-grained sediment, possibly volcanic in origin." "The particle analyzer is showing high sulfur content," Amelia reported as preliminary data came in. "And something else. There are organic compounds present, but degraded. This might be decomposed biological matter." "Mass die-off?" I suggested. "If something killed all the marine life in the area, this could be what's left after it settled to the bottom." "On this scale," Amelia sounded skeptical. "What could cause that kind of mass mortality event without anyone noticing until now?" It was a good question, one I didn't have an answer for. I maneuvered the Minnow in a slow arc, surveying more of the seafloor. The barren landscape extended in all directions, featureless and dead. "Wait," Amelia said suddenly. "What's that?" I followed her gaze to a spot about 30 m to our port side. Among the flat expanse of pale sediment, something stood out, a dark, irregular shape protruding from the seafloor. "Let's check it out," I said, adjusting our thrusters to move us closer. As we approached, the object took on more definition. It wasn't a rock formation, as I'd initially thought. The shape was too regular, with curved edges and a distinctive spiral pattern. "That looks organic," Amelia said, her voice tense with excitement. "A shell of some kind." I nodded slowly, my mind racing through possibilities. "It's huge, whatever it is, at least 2 m across from what I can see. When we were positioned directly above the object, I extended the manipulator arms again, this time with more caution. I brushed away some of the sediment covering part of the spiral pattern, revealing more of its structure. The material was clearly calcified, with a distinct patterned surface that no modern manufacturing process could replicate. "This is a shell fragment," I said, my excitement building. "And not just any shell. The spiral formation, the nodules along this ridge. This bears a striking resemblance to an ammonite." "An ammonite?" Amelia leaned forward, her face almost pressed against the viewport glass. "That can't be right. Ammonites went extinct with the dinosaurs." "Exactly." I zoomed in the camera, capturing high-resolution images of the shell fragment. "This looks like Cretaceous period marine fauna. The structure, the size, it matches specimens I've only seen in museums. But exposed on the seafloor like this? That's impossible." Amelia shook her head. "Cretaceous fossils would be embedded in rock layers, not sitting exposed on the ocean bottom." She was right. Of course, finding an ammonite shell, or something remarkably similar just lying on the seafloor, was like finding a dinosaur bone in your backyard. Not slightly buried, not encased in stone, but simply sitting there as if recently deposited. Could volcanic activity have disrupted deeper sediment layers? I wondered aloud, maneuvering the manipulator arm to collect a small sample from the edge of the shell. Maybe upwelled material from far below. "Not without major seismic events," Amelia said. "We're talking tectonic scale disruption to expose something this old, and that would have registered on monitoring stations across the Pacific." I was about to respond when a shadow passed above us, too quickly to identify, but large enough to momentarily block our top-mounted lights. "Did you see that?" I asked, looking up through the upper viewport. Amelia nodded, her expression tense. "Something big, maybe a whale. In a dead zone? Not likely." I pulled back the manipulator arms and began powering up the thrusters. "Let's back off a bit and get a better view of the surrounding area." Before I could engage reverse thrust, something slammed into the starboard side of the submersible with tremendous force. The impact threw me against my harness, knocking the wind from my lungs. The minnow rolled sideways, instrumentation panels flashing with warning lights. "What was that?" Amelia gasped, gripping her console to steady herself. "Unknown contact." I fought with the controls, trying to stabilize our position, checking external cameras. A second impact, this time from below, sent the submersible tumbling end over end. Warning klaxons blared as our depth sensors registered rapid, uncontrolled movement. "Hull integrity holding," I reported, scanning the status displays. "But we've got multiple system warnings. Starboard thruster is offline." I managed to engage the remaining thrusters, bringing our rotation under control. The minnow stabilized, but we'd been pushed nearly 30 meters off our previous position. The seafloor was a swirling cloud of disturbed sediment beneath us. "Surface vessel, this is Minnow," I called into the radio. "We've experienced multiple impacts from an unknown object, possible marine mammal, but behavior is aggressive and atypical." Static answered me. The communication system indicator flashed yellow, partial functionality. "Comms are degraded," I said to Amelia. "The impact must have damaged the external antenna." "Ben, look." Amelia pointed through the main viewport. Through the settling cloud of sediment, a massive shape moved in the darkness beyond our lights. At first, I could only make out a vague silhouette. Something big, at least 10 meters long, with fluid, powerful movements. "Get the external floods on full power," I instructed, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Amelia increased the intensity of our external lighting array, pushing back the darkness. For several tense seconds, we saw nothing but empty water and swirling sediment. Then it appeared again, circling just at the edge of visibility. The creature entered our light field, and I felt the air freeze in my lungs. A shark, but unlike any living shark species known to science. Its body was massive, at least 15 from snout to tail. The head featured a distinctive rounded shape with a protruding snout and jaws that looked capable of swallowing a person whole. Multiple rows of teeth gleamed in the submersible's lights. Most strikingly, it didn't move like modern sharks. The tail had an asymmetrical shape with the upper lobe significantly larger than the lower, creating a distinctive swimming pattern I'd only seen in fossil reconstructions and scientific illustrations. "That's impossible," I whispered, my scientific mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. "That's a creepypasta." "A what?" Amelia asked, her voice barely audible over the warning system still chiming through the cabin. "Creepypasta mantelli, the Ginsu shark from the late Cretaceous period." I watched in disbelief as the massive predator circled our submersible. It went extinct 80 million years ago. The shark made another pass, closer this time. Its eye, dark and ancient, seemed to study us with predatory intelligence. This was no mindless attack. The creature was assessing us, trying to determine what we were and whether we were prey. How is this possible? Amelia's scientific training was battling with the reality before us. Could it be a new species that just resembles extinct forms? I shook my head, watching the prehistoric predator's movements. No modern shark has that tail morphology or tooth pattern. This is exactly like the fossil specimens. It's like looking at a living fossil, but one that shouldn't exist. The shark completed another circle, then suddenly changed direction, heading straight for us. Its massive jaws opened, revealing rows of serrated teeth designed for slicing through the hardest prey. "Brace!" I shouted, engaging all functioning thrusters in an attempt to evade. The minnow lurched sideways, barely avoiding the full force of the attack. Still, the shark's flank scraped along our hull, causing the entire submersible to shudder. More warning lights flashed across my control panel. "Hull integrity at 87%, I reported, scanning the damage assessments. "We need to get out of here." "The comms are working again," Amelia said. "Signal strength increasing." I grabbed the radio. "Surface vessel, this is Minnow. Emergency ascent required. We are under attack by an unidentified marine predator. Large, aggressive, and..." I hesitated, knowing how it would sound, bearing striking resemblance to extinct Cretaceous fauna. Through static, Grayson's voice came back. "Minnow, confirm your last. Did you say Cretaceous?" "Affirmative," I replied. "I know how it sounds, but we have visual confirmation and recording, initiating emergency ascent now." As I engaged our ascent protocol, the shark circled back for another pass. In the submersible's lights, I could see every detail of this living impossibility. The prehistoric profile, the ancient eyes, the body design perfected for hunting in Cretaceous seas, and somehow, inexplicably, still hunting today. The monster banked in a wide arc and came straight back at us. I could see it clearly now in our external lights. 15 m of streamlined predator, with a mouth full of serrated teeth, each one as big as my thumb. The creature was a dead ringer for creepypasta mantelli, a prehistoric shark species that had no business swimming around in the 21st century. These things went extinct 78 million years ago, yet here it was, a Ginsu shark from the Cretaceous period, very much alive and apparently intent on eating us. "It's coming back," Amelia said, her voice tight with fear. She gripped the edge of her console so hard her knuckles turned white. I fought to keep the minnow steady as we continued our emergency ascent. The depth gauge showed 680 m, way too deep. Even with emergency protocols, we'd need 20 minutes to reach a safe depth, and that was assuming nothing else went wrong. "Ben, look, there's another one." Amelia pointed to the starboard camera feed. My stomach dropped. A second shark, nearly identical to the first, had appeared from the murky water. It matched the first in size and prehistoric profile. "That's impossible," I whispered, but the evidence swam right before my eyes. The water outside our viewport darkened as a third massive shape joined the others. 3 creepypasta sharks, 3 extinct predators that shouldn't exist. "They're coordinating," I said as the sharks spread out in a formation that looked disturbingly deliberate. "See how they're positioning themselves? That's pack hunting behavior." "Sharks don't hunt in packs," Amelia said automatically, the marine biologist in her speaking despite our crisis. "These ones do." I watched as they moved with unsettling synchronization. "That's not random. They're surrounding us." I'd studied enough shark behavior to know this was wrong on multiple levels. Most modern sharks are solitary hunters. Even species that gather in groups don't show this kind of coordinated attack pattern. Yet these prehistoric monsters moved with terrifying purpose, as if executing a rehearsed plan. I grabbed the radio handset, my fingers slipping on the plastic. Surface Vessel Grayson, this is Minnow. We are under attack by multiple marine predators and requesting immediate extraction coordinates. Repeat, we need immediate extraction. Over. The radio hissed static back at me. Surface Vessel Grayson, do you copy? Over. More static. We're too deep, I told Amelia. Signal can't get through reliably at this depth. What about the emergency frequency? I switched channels and tried again. Mayday, Mayday. Research vessel Minnow declaring emergency at approximately 650 meters depth. Coordinates. The submersible lurched violently as one of the sharks slammed into our port side. Warning lights flashed across my control panel. The impact sent Amelia tumbling from her seat. Status report, I shouted. Amelia pulled herself back to her station. Hull integrity compromised in Section 3. We're taking on water. A second impact rocked us from the opposite side. The sharks were taking turns, hitting us from different angles. The Minnow was built to withstand extreme pressure, not coordinated attacks from creatures with jaws powerful enough to crush bone. A sharp metallic groan filled the cabin as the hull bent inward on the port side. Beneath that sound came something worse. The quiet hiss of water spraying into the cabin. There, Amelia pointed to a hairline fracture spreading across the reinforced viewport glass. Water misted through it with each subtle flex of the hull. Red alarm lights bathed the cabin as the computer voice announced, "Warning, hull breach detected. Emergency protocols activated." I hit the controls to seal the compromised section, but the damage was already done. The crack in the viewport couldn't be isolated. Water trickled steadily into the cabin. A small problem now, but potentially fatal if the crack expanded. Backup power systems online, I said, activating our secondary circuits, rerouting all available power to ascent thrusters. Our depth gauge showed 620 meters, still way too deep. Amelia wiped spray from her face. What about the emergency ascent pod? They'd tear it apart. I cut her off. That pod is designed for mechanical failures, not predator attacks. It's smaller, less reinforced. Those sharks would rip through it before we made it halfway to the surface. The largest shark suddenly appeared directly in front of the viewport. In the bright lights of our external lamps, I saw every detail of this living fossil. The distinctive profile, the ancient eyes that seemed to hold a cold intelligence. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of teeth designed for slicing through the toughest prey. The shark rammed the viewport head-on. The impact knocked us backward, and the hairline fracture suddenly splintered outward like a spiderweb. Water now sprayed into the cabin in a steady stream rather than a mist. Pressure differential is increasing the breach, I said, trying to sound clinical rather than terrified. The deeper we are, the more force pushing that water through. We need to surface faster, Amelia said. The ascent rate is maxed out. Any faster, and we risk decompression issues. I didn't add that a rapid ascent would also put massive strain on our already compromised hull. I flipped the switch for our external defense system, activating electrical pulse deterrence. Modern sharks were sensitive to electrical fields. Even great whites would turn away from a strong enough pulse. It was our last non-lethal defense option. The external panels charged and released a series of powerful electrical pulses into the water surrounding us. I watched the monitor, waiting for the sharks to react, to turn away. They didn't even flinch. No effect, Amelia said unnecessarily. They're not responding to the electrical field at all. I ran another pulse sequence, stronger this time. Either their nervous systems are wired differently from modern sharks, or what? I didn't want to say it out loud. Or they've been modified somehow. Water pooled around our feet, sloshing with the movement of the submersible. The stream from the cracked viewport was growing stronger. 590 m. Amelia read from the depth gauge. We were ascending, but not fast enough. The largest shark swam in a tight circle and came at us again. I tried to maneuver away, but the minnow responded sluggishly. The shark struck the already damaged viewport, and this time I heard a distinct crack as the fracture widened further. Water now sprayed into the cabin with alarming force. The electrical system sparked as seawater hit exposed wiring. "Ben, we need options," Amelia shouted over the noise of the alarms and rushing water. I ran through our remaining choices. None of them good. The emergency ballast drop would make us rise faster, but would also make us harder to control. The distress beacon was already active, but at this depth, it was unlikely anyone would pick it up in time. The sharks circled us in perfect formation, waiting for their next chance to strike. What about the sample collection containers? Amelia suggested suddenly. They're pressurized. If we eject them all at once, a distraction, I finished her thought. It might work. I accessed the external collection system. We had 8 sample containers attached to the minnow's underbelly, each one pressurized to prevent sample contamination. Releasing all sample containers on my mark, I said. 3, 2, 1, mark. I hit the release button. On the external camera feed, we watched as 8 cylindrical containers shot away from the submersible in different directions. The sudden movement and pressure changes created a chaotic disruption in the water.
2 of the sharks immediately turned to investigate the containers. The third, the largest one, stayed focused on us. "It's working," Amelia said. "Partially," I corrected. "We've still got one on our tail." The water level inside the cabin had risen to our ankles. The electrical system sputtered and several monitors flickered. "We need to shut down non-essential systems," I said. "Redirect all power to ascent and life support." Amelia began the shutdown sequence while I steered the submersible in a zigzag pattern, trying to shake our pursuer. 500 meter, Amelia announced. "We're making progress." The remaining sharks slammed into our stern, sending us into a spin. I fought the controls, trying to stabilize our ascent. "The other 2 are coming back," Amelia warned, watching the rear cameras. "They've lost interest in the containers." All 3 prehistoric predators regrouped behind us once again, moving in perfect synchronization. This wasn't natural behavior. Not for any shark species I'd ever studied. Something was very wrong here. "Ben, I've been thinking," Amelia said, her voice suddenly calm despite the water now reaching mid-calf. "The shell fragment we found, the ammonite, what if it wasn't just similar to a Cretaceous species? What if it was a Cretaceous species?" I looked at her, understanding what she was suggesting. "You think these sharks aren't just similar to Cretoxorhina? You think they are Cretoxorhina? Actual living fossils?" She nodded. "The dead zone, the sulfur content, the ash-like sediment. What if there's been some kind of upwelling? Something bringing up preserved Cretaceous-era materials and organisms from deep within the seafloor?" It sounded crazy, but no crazier than what we were currently experiencing. "That still doesn't explain how they're alive," I said. "Or why they're hunting in a coordinated pack." The largest shark rammed us again. This time the impact knocked out our main lights, plunging the cabin into darkness until the emergency lighting kicked in a dim red glow that made the spraying water look like blood. 460 m, Amelia said, reading from the depth gauge. "We're still ascending, but we're taking on water faster than the pumps can handle it." I opened the emergency toolkit and pulled out a tube of quick-setting epoxy designed for underwater repairs. "Keep us on ascent course," I told Amelia. "I'm going to try to seal that crack." I waded through the knee-high water to the viewport. Up close, the fracture looked even worse. A spider web of cracks spreading from a central impact point. Water sprayed through with enough force to sting my face. I squeezed the epoxy onto the crack, trying to force it into the fractures. The pressure made it difficult, pushing the sealant back out almost as fast as I could apply it, but gradually I managed to cover the worst sections. "It's not going to hold for long," I warned as I made my way back to the controls, "but it might buy us some time." The water level had stopped rising as quickly, but our electrical systems were starting to fail. Short circuits sparked throughout the cabin. Life support at 68%. I kept my eyes fixed on the pressure gauge, watching the needle jump suddenly to the right. Something big was moving nearby, something displacing a significant amount of water. "Do you see that?" I asked, tapping the gauge. "The reading shouldn't have spiked like that unless—" The shadows outside the viewport shifted. The circling sharks paused their attack, their streamlined bodies twisting in the water as if responding to something beyond our field of vision. I squinted through the cracked glass, trying to make sense of the changing light patterns. "Look," Amelia whispered, pointing up. A massive shadow passed over us, so large it darkened our entire field of view. The external lights of the minnow reflected off what appeared to be an enormous carapace moving slowly above us. "What is that?" Amelia asked, her voice tight with fear and wonder. I checked our sonar display. where a large mass registered nearly 30 feet across, the size of a small submarine. The water level inside the cabin continued to rise, now covering our ankles completely. But for a moment, I forgot about our predicament. "That's impossible," I muttered, pressing closer to the viewport despite the hairline fracture spreading across its surface. As the creature drifted downward into our lights, I could make out more details. The massive shell was domed and ridged, with paddle-like appendages extending from its sides. My scientific mind cataloged the features automatically. The distinctive pattern of the carapace, the enormous front flippers, the proportions and scale. "That's an archelon," I said, barely trusting my own words. "A prehistoric sea turtle from the late Cretaceous period." "Like the sharks?" Amelia asked, joining me at the viewport. The cold water sloshed around our feet as she moved. "Yes, but even rarer. They went extinct around 66 million years ago." I tracked the turtle's movement as it descended in front of our submersible like a living island. "They're the largest sea turtles ever discovered. This one must be at least 15 feet long." The archelon drifted downward with surprising grace for its enormous bulk, its shadow creating a dark umbrella above us, its body blocking out the dim light from the surface far above. In any other circumstances, I would have been ecstatic at such a discovery. Living proof of a species thought extinct for millions of years. "Look at the sharks," Amelia said. The Cretoxorhina had redirected their attention to this new arrival. They circled the giant turtle, their behavior shifting from the coordinated pattern they'd shown while attacking us. One shark darted forward suddenly, teeth flashing as it struck at one of the turtle's massive front flippers. "They're attacking it," I noted, watching as a second shark joined the first, targeting the turtle's rear flipper on the opposite side. The archelon's reaction was immediate and surprisingly fast for such a large animal. Its head and all four flippers pulled inward with practiced efficiency, retreating into the protection of its enormous armored shell. The movement suggested an ancient instinctual response to predators. A warning light flashed on the control panel, drawing my attention back to our own crisis. The water level inside the minnow had risen past our ankles and was steadily climbing toward mid-calf. "Hull integrity at 42%, Amelia reported, her voice steadier now as she focused on the immediate threat to our lives rather than the prehistoric spectacle outside. "We need to keep ascending." I glanced back at the sharks, which were now fully occupied with their assault on the turtle. They struck repeatedly at the edges of the shell, searching for vulnerable points but finding none. The archelon had become a fortress, its armored carapace too thick for even the powerful jaws of the Cretoxorhina. "This is our chance," I said, an idea forming as I watched the interaction between these ancient species. The minnow systems were failing around us. The electrical shorts had increased, with several monitors now completely dark. The water continued to rise inside the cabin, and the epoxy patch I'd applied to the viewport crack was already showing signs of failure under the immense pressure. "What do you mean?" Amelia asked, steadying herself against the console as the submersible tilted slightly. "Those sharks are distracted by the turtle. We need to use this opportunity." I turned back to the controls, assessing what systems we still had available. "The main thrusters are damaged, but we might have enough power for controlled movement." I ran a quick diagnostic, finding that we had approximately 30% thrust capacity remaining. Not enough for a rapid ascent, but potentially enough for short, controlled movements. "What's your plan?" Amelia asked, returning to her station. The water had risen to just below our knees now, making movement through the cabin increasingly difficult. I felt the cold seeping through my clothes, but pushed the discomfort aside. "We're going to use that turtle as cover," I explained, hands working the controls. "If we position ourselves under its shell, the sharks won't be able to reach us." "Is that safe?" she asked. "Safer than what we're doing now," I replied, activating what remained of our maneuvering thrusters. The minnow responded sluggishly, the damaged systems protesting with grinding sounds that echoed through the hull. "It's an archelon ischiros," I continued, focusing on the science to keep my mind clear. "Their shells evolved specifically to withstand predator attacks. If those sharks couldn't bite through it millions of years ago, they can't do it now." The submersible lurched forward awkwardly. I adjusted our trajectory, aiming for the space beneath the giant turtle. On the sonar display, I could see the sharks continuing their assault, circling and striking at the edges of the shell without success. "What if it sees us as a threat?" Amelia asked, gripping her console as another electrical system shorted out with a spark and a hiss. "It won't," I said with more confidence than I felt. "Sea turtles aren't aggressive predators. At worst, it'll try to move away from us, which would still give us a chance to continue our ascent. I carefully maneuvered the minnow toward the underbelly of the massive turtle. The water inside the cabin continued to rise, now reaching just above our knees. The cold had numbed my lower legs, making precise movements more difficult. We need to shut down the external lights once we're in position, I said. The sharks seem to be attracted to them, and we don't want to draw their attention back to us. Amelia nodded, her fingers hovering over the appropriate controls. Ready when you are. As we approached the underside of the Archelon, I could better appreciate its true scale. The carapace alone was larger than our entire submersible. The plastron, the underbelly of the shell, stretched out above us like the ceiling of a cathedral, its ancient armor patterned with ridges and growth marks that told a story millions of years in the making. The sharks continued their attack on the turtle, seemingly oblivious to our movement. They struck at the edges of the shell where the flippers had disappeared, their frustration evident in the increasing ferocity of their assaults. Almost there, I murmured, making a final adjustment to our position. The minnow shuddered as another system failed. The primary oxygen recycling unit went offline with a low hum, automatically switching to backup. A warning indicator showed we had approximately 2 hours of emergency oxygen remaining, assuming no further damage to the systems. Hull integrity at 38%, Amelia reported, her voice tight. Water intake is accelerating. I nodded grimly. The water had risen another inch in just the past few minutes. At this rate, the cabin would be half flooded within the hour. With careful precision, I guided the damaged submersible directly beneath the center of the Archelon's massive body. From this position, the turtle's shell extended beyond us in all directions, creating a protective ceiling that the sharks couldn't penetrate. Now, I said to Amelia, cut the external lights. She pressed the controls, and the illumination outside our viewport vanished, plunging us into near-complete darkness. The only light now came from the emergency systems inside the cabin and the dim glow of the remaining functional monitors. My eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. Above us, I could make out the silhouette of the Archelon, a darker shape against the marginally lighter water. The sonar display showed the sharks still circling, but their pattern had changed. Without the lights to guide them, they seemed less certain of our position. It's working, Amelia whispered, as if afraid the sharks might hear her. They're staying focused on the turtle. I allowed myself a moment of relief, but it was short-lived. The water level inside the cabin had reached mid-thigh, making movement increasingly difficult. The temperature of the water was dangerously cold, and I could feel the first signs of numbness spreading up my legs. We need to continue ascending, I said, checking our depth gauge. We're still at 390 m. Even if we reach the surface, we'll need immediate extraction. I activated what remained of our vertical thrusters, hoping to begin a slow ascent while maintaining our position beneath the turtle. The response from the engines was weak, barely a tremor through the submersible. The thrusters aren't responding properly, I said, trying again with slightly more power. The water damage must be affecting the electrical systems. Amelia was checking the diagnostics on her console. Power output is fluctuating. We might not have enough to maintain both position and ascent. I considered our options, limited as they were. We'll need to use the turtle as an elevator, I decided, shifting our focus back to the prehistoric creature above us. What do you mean? Amelia asked. Sea turtles need to surface for air, I explained. Even a species as ancient as Archelon had lungs, not gills. Once it feels safe from the sharks, it's going to head for the surface. If we can stay positioned underneath it, we go up when it goes up, Amelia finished, understanding my plan. Exactly. And it provides us cover from the sharks the whole way. As if responding to my words, the giant turtle began to move. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, its massive flippers extended cautiously from the protection of its shell. Through the viewport, I could see the powerful limbs begin to push against the water. It's moving, I confirmed, watching with a mixture of scientific fascination and desperate hope. Get ready to adjust our position if needed. The sharks immediately detected the turtle's movements, their sleek forms darting toward the newly exposed flippers. The Archelon responded by pulling back slightly, but didn't fully retreat into its shell again. Instead, it seemed to be testing the waters, determining if the threat had passed. One of the sharks struck at a rear flipper, its teeth scraping against the tough hide. The turtle pulled the limb back quickly, then extended it again when the shark moved away. This dance continued for several minutes, with the Archelon gradually extending its limbs more fully despite the occasional attacks from the sharks. It's getting ready to move, I said, recognizing the behavior. Modern sea turtles do the same thing when avoiding tiger sharks. They wait for the right moment, then make a break for it. The water inside the cabin had risen to our waists now. Several more electrical systems had shorted out, leaving us with minimal controls. The epoxy patch on the viewport was holding, but barely. Small beads of water were beginning to seep through the edges. "We're not going to last much longer," Amelia said, her voice calm despite the direness of our situation. "Temperature is dropping inside the cabin as more water enters. We have maybe 30 minutes before hypothermia becomes a serious risk." I nodded, my eyes fixed on the massive turtle above us. "Come on," I whispered to the ancient creature. "Time to go." As if hearing my plea, the Arslan suddenly extended all 4 flippers to their full length and began to swim upward with powerful, deliberate strokes. The movement was surprisingly swift for such a massive animal, the result of millions of years of evolutionary adaptation to life in the open ocean. "It's ascending," I called out, quickly adjusting our position to stay beneath it. "Match our vertical angle to its trajectory." Amelia worked the remaining functional controls, helping to keep the minnow directly below the turtle's body. The sharks reacted immediately to the movement, following the turtle's ascent and occasionally darting in to strike at its flippers. But the Arslan's powerful upward strokes kept it moving steadily toward the surface. "It's working," Amelia said, a note of hope in her voice for the first time since the attack began. I checked our depth gauge, watching as the numbers slowly decreased. The turtle was indeed taking us upward, its massive body serving as both shield and elevator. The sharks continued to circle, but they remained focused on the turtle rather than our darkened submersible. The water inside the cabin continued to rise, now reaching the bottom of the control consoles. Several systems sparked and went dead as they became submerged. Our mobility was severely limited, but as long as the turtle continued to ascend, we had a chance. 270 m, Amelia reported, reading the depth gauge. "We're ascending at approximately 10 m per minute. It was slower than our standard ascent rate, but given our damaged condition, it was better than I dared hope. If the Arslan maintained this pace, we would reach the surface in less than 30 minutes. The massive turtle continued its steady upward movement, its ancient instincts driving it toward the air it needed to breathe. Its enormous shell blocked our view of the sharks, but the sonar indicated they were still following, unwilling to abandon their potential prey. In the dim emergency lighting, I looked at Amelia. Despite everything, there was a hint of wonder in her eyes as she watched the prehistoric creature above us. Even facing possible death, the scientist in her and both of us couldn't help but marvel at what we were witnessing. "If we make it back," she said quietly, "no one will believe what we've seen. When we make it back," I corrected her, "we'll have proof." I nodded toward the camera system, which was still functioning on backup power. "Everything is being recorded." As we continued our slow ascent beneath the protective shell of a creature that shouldn't exist, I found myself wondering about the implications of our discovery. An entire ecosystem of prehistoric marine life, somehow surviving unchanged for millions of years in this isolated section of the Pacific. It defied everything we thought we knew about extinction and evolution. The water level inside the cabin reached my chest, the cold, now a constant numbing presence. But as I watched the depth gauge continue its gradual descent, I allowed myself to believe that we might actually survive to tell our story. Above us, hidden in its ancient armor, the Arslan carried us upward through the darkness, away from the sharks and toward the light. The Arslan's massive shell blocked out all natural light above us, creating a strange protective dome. I kept my eyes fixed on the depth gauge. 280 m now. Progress, but agonizingly slow. The prehistoric turtle's steady swimming had already carried us upward about 20 meters from where we'd first slipped beneath it. "Ben, the port side electrical panel is completely underwater now," Amelia said, her voice tight with controlled panic. I turned to see sparks dancing across the water's surface inside the cabin. The seawater had risen higher than I'd realized, already covering the lower third of our instrument panels. Even with our emergency measures, water continued to seep in through the compromised hull sections faster than our pumps could handle. "Kill the power to that panel," I said. "We need to conserve whatever systems we still have." Amelia reached through the rising water to flip the breaker switches, wincing as cold water reached past her elbow. The sparks died immediately, plunging that corner of the cabin into darkness. "I've never felt so cold," she said, pulling her arm back and hugging herself. "How long before we reach the surface?" I did some quick calculations in my head. "At this rate, hours. The Arslan isn't exactly built for speed. The reality of our situation settled between us. The cabin water, now reaching the middle of my chest, felt like liquid ice. Hypothermia would become a real danger long before we reached the surface if we didn't take action. "We need the emergency suits," I said. "They're in the overhead compartment." I reached up and unlatched the storage bin above our heads, thankful it was still above the waterline. Inside were 2 orange neoprene survival suits designed for emergency evacuation. I handed one to Amelia and took the other. "What about the oxygen?" she asked, eyeing the rising water level. "Grab the backup tanks too. We've got about 40 minutes each. Not enough for the full ascent, but enough to buy us time if the cabin completely floods before we reach the surface." Putting on the survival suits in the confined, partially flooded cabin was an awkward process. I had to brace myself against the control panel to keep from floating in the rising water while wiggling into the tight neoprene material. The suit's insulation immediately began warming my core, providing blessed relief from the numbing cold of the Pacific water. Once suited up, I checked Amelia's seals and oxygen hookups before securing my own. The small tanks attached to our suits weren't meant for long-term use, but they would keep us alive when the cabin fully flooded. Above us, I heard the dull thud of impact as one of the sharks slammed against the Archelon's shell again. The entire submersible vibrated with the force of it. Amelia flinched, her eyes wide behind her face mask. "They're still out there," she whispered. I nodded, turning to the sonar display that was still functioning. 3 signatures still circling us. I adjusted a dial, focusing the acoustic sensors. "They're staying close to the Archelon, probably hoping for another shot at its flippers." The rhythmic pounding continued overhead, the sound of prehistoric predators trying to get through what must have been their natural enemy's defense. The sheer improbability of our situation wasn't lost on me. Modern humans seeking protection from Cretaceous sharks beneath the shell of an extinct sea turtle. If we survived, the scientific implications would be staggering. My thoughts turned to Gladys Ferguson, my mentor during my early research days. I could almost hear her calm, measured voice from our training sessions in the North Atlantic. "Patience is your greatest tool in marine observation, Ezra. The ocean works on its own timescale. Minutes become hours, hours become days. Learn to wait without anxiety, and you'll see what others miss." Those words had shaped my approach to fieldwork for years. Now they might just keep us alive. "We need to power down everything non-essential," I told Amelia. "Navigation, external lights, everything except sonar and minimal life support. We'll drift with the Archelon and conserve what power we have left." Amelia nodded and began the shutdown sequence while I monitored the sonar. The sharks continued their relentless assault on the turtle's shell, their movements creating clear acoustic signatures on our display. "What happens when the cabin completely floods?" Amelia asked quietly after several minutes had passed. The water had risen to just below our shoulders now. Our seats were completely submerged, forcing us to stand awkwardly in the small cabin. Each system failure meant another dark section of the control panel. "We'll breathe from the tanks," I explained, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "The survival suits will protect us from the cold and pressure for a while. If we can reach shallow enough depths before the tanks run out, we might be able to make an emergency evacuation." I didn't mention the alternative running out of oxygen while still too deep to safely swim to the surface, or worse, still being surrounded by prehistoric sharks with nowhere to hide. Some fears were better left unspoken. Another hour passed in tense silence. The water continued to rise inexorably, forcing us to crane our necks upward as it reached our chins. The electrical systems sputtered and died one by one as seawater claimed them. Only the battery-powered sonar and depth gauge remained functional, providing our sole window to the outside world. 200 m, I announced, watching the numbers on the depth display. "We're making progress." "The sharks?" Amelia asked. I studied the acoustic signatures on the sonar display. Still circling, but the attacks seemed less frequent now.
Indeed, the thuds against the shell above us had slowed from every few minutes to maybe once every 15 or 20. The Cretaceous arena appeared to be losing interest, or perhaps tiring from the unsuccessful attacks against the turtle's impenetrable armor. "Prehistoric patience running out," I murmured, more to myself than to Amelia. "What do you mean?" "Predators have energy budgets," I explained, grateful for something to focus on besides our rising danger. "They can only expend so much energy hunting before the effort outweighs the potential caloric gain from a meal. These sharks have been attacking for hours with no success. Eventually, they'll move on to easier prey." Another impact rattled the submersible, but it seemed less forceful than before. "That one hit at a different angle," I noted, studying the sonar. They're starting to break formation. Look at the signature patterns. They're not coordinating their movements as tightly anymore. The water level had now risen to our lower lips, forcing us to tilt our heads back to keep our faces above water. I activated my oxygen tank and pulled the mask over my face, motioning for Amelia to do the same. The first breath of compressed air felt artificial and metallic, but it was better than drowning. With our masks on, communication became more difficult. We resorted to hand signals and pointing at the few displays still functioning above the waterline. The sonar continued to show the sharks' movements, and I watched with growing hope as their attack patterns became increasingly erratic and independent. I tapped my wrist, indicating the passage of time, then held up 5 fingers. Amelia nodded, understanding my message. Give it 5 more minutes before we make any decisions. Patience remained our best strategy. Those 5 minutes stretched interminably as the water climbed higher, eventually submerging us completely. The cabin was now fully flooded, our survival depending entirely on our suits and oxygen tanks. The bizarre weightlessness of floating inside our own submersible created a surreal feeling, as if we were suspended between worlds. Not quite in the ocean, not quite in our vessel. I focused intensely on the sonar display, now the only illumination in our darkened cabin. 2 shark signatures moved away from our position, swimming in wide arcs that took them farther from the Archelon with each pass. The third shark, likely the largest based on its acoustic signature, continued to circle but at a greater distance than before. Amelia pointed excitedly at the display, then made a thumbs-up gesture. I nodded but held up a cautionary hand. We weren't safe yet. Sharks were known to retreat temporarily, only to return when least expected. Another 30 minutes passed as we floated in our flooded cabin, conserving oxygen and watching the sonar. The depth gauge showed 130 m. We were making steady progress toward the surface, though still too deep for an emergency evacuation. Finally, I saw what I had been waiting for. The last shark signature began to move away, its pattern changing from a hunting circle to a more directed path. I watched intently as the distance increased, hardly daring to believe our good fortune. 10 minutes later, the signatures had faded to the edge of our detection range. I tapped Amelia's shoulder and pointed to the screen, then gave her a definitive thumbs up. She responded with an underwater victory dance that sent her bumping into the ceiling of our flooded cabin. I checked the oxygen gauge on my tank. 15 minutes of air remaining. Not enough to reach the surface, but if the Archelon maintained its current pace, we might get close enough to risk an evacuation. The survival suits would provide some protection during our final ascent if necessary. The minutes ticked by as I alternated between watching the depth gauge and checking the sonar. 100 meters, 90, 80. The Archelon's steady progress continued, carrying us closer to safety with each passing minute. The shark signatures had completely disappeared from our detection range, though I kept monitoring for any sign of their return. As we passed the 70 m mark, I made a decision. I pulled myself close to Amelia and pointed to the emergency hatch above our heads, then to the depth gauge, followed by a questioning thumbs up. She hesitated, glancing at her own oxygen gauge, which I knew must be showing similar reserves to my own. Perhaps 10 minutes left. She finally nodded in agreement. I reached for the emergency release mechanism on the hatch, but paused before activating it. Something compelled me to take one final look at the sonar display. The screen showed nothing but empty water around us. No shark signatures anywhere within range. After hours of tension and fear, their absence felt almost unbelievable. The acoustic signatures had completely faded from our detection range, giving us our first real hope since the attack began. I turned back to the hatch release, ready to make our final ascent to the surface under the continued protection of our prehistoric guardian. I grabbed the emergency hatch release and braced myself. Through my mask, I watched the sonar screen one final time, making sure the water around us was clear. No sharks, just us and the ancient turtle floating above. Before I could pull the lever, a vibration rippled through what remained of our submersible. Not violent like a shark attack, more like a gentle tremor running through the metal frame. I paused, looking up through the cracked viewport. The Archelon stirred. After hours of serving as our shield, the massive prehistoric turtle uncurled from its defensive position. Its enormous flippers, each longer than a car, stretched outward from beneath the domed shell. The head, bigger than my entire torso, extended forward on a thick, muscular neck. I grabbed Amelia's arm and pointed upward, making sure she saw it too. Her eyes widened behind her mask. We'd both been treating the creature like a living roof, but now it was waking up, becoming active. The Archelon pushed against the ocean floor with its rear flippers, kicking up clouds of sediment. Its movements were surprisingly graceful for something so enormous. The giant turtle began swimming upward with powerful strokes, gaining momentum. I knew immediately this was our chance. The creature was heading toward the surface, exactly where we needed to go. I tapped Amelia's shoulder and pointed to the emergency procedures panel. We couldn't speak underwater, but she nodded, understanding. We'd drilled emergency protocols countless times, though I'd never imagined we'd actually need to use them. The minnow wasn't just a submersible. It contained a detachable emergency ascent pod designed for exactly this kind of catastrophic failure. The pod was basically a reinforced escape capsule, built into the upper section of the cabin with its own propulsion system. We'd need to gather our essential equipment, seal ourselves inside, and release from the main structure. I swam to the control panel and began the preparation sequence, punching in the authorization code. A section of the ceiling, illuminated with red emergency lighting, outlining the pod's sealed doorway. Water had filled almost the entire main cabin. Now only a small air pocket remained near the ceiling, barely enough to fit our heads if we removed our masks, which we wouldn't risk. The cold had seeped through my survival suit, making my fingers clumsy on the keypad. I had to focus intensely to hit the right buttons. The pod's door unsealed with a mechanical click I could feel rather than hear through the water. I pulled it down, revealing the compact interior of our lifeboat. The space was tight, designed for 2 people in an emergency, not comfort. It contained 2 secured seats, basic navigation controls, and a small viewport. Amelia swam to our research station and began collecting sample containers. Smart thinking. We hadn't come all this way to leave empty-handed. The evidence of living prehistoric marine species would revolutionize our understanding of evolution and extinction events. If we survived to share it, I checked my oxygen gauge. 12 minutes remaining. Not much time. The ascent pod had its own air supply, but we needed to work quickly. I swam to help Amelia, grabbing the waterproof case containing our hard drives and research data. Together, we moved our samples into the pod, securing them in the storage compartment. Water swirled around us as we worked, the neutralized weight of the containers, making them easy to handle despite their size. Next, I needed to program our ascent coordinates. The pod's navigation system was separate from the minnow's main computers, designed to function independently in emergencies. I entered our current depth and the GPS coordinates for the Grayson's last known position, hoping our support vessel was still in the area looking for us. The computer calculated our trajectory, showing a clean ascent path directly to the surface. The pod would shoot upward quickly, much faster than the main submersible could ever move. Amelia tapped my shoulder and gestured toward the sonar display, her movements urgent. I looked at the screen and felt my stomach drop. 3 signatures had reappeared at the edge of our detection range. The sharks were turning. They weren't heading directly for us, though. Their movement patterns tracked the Archelon, which continued to swim upward about 30 m above us. Amelia pointed to the sharks, then made a slashing motion across her throat, asking if they would attack us during our ascent. I shook my head and held up my hand, palm flat, then moved it quickly upward, mimicking how fast the pod would rise. Then I pointed to the Archelon signature on the sonar and circled my finger around it. The message was clear. The sharks were following the larger creature, and our pod would move too quickly for them to catch. She nodded, but her eyes still showed concern. I understood. After everything we'd been through, it was hard to believe we might actually escape. Water had completely filled the main cabin now, eliminating even the small air pocket that had remained. The electrical systems were failing, one by one, lights flickering out as circuits shorted. Soon, the minnow would be nothing but a dark metal coffin on the ocean floor. We needed to go. I checked my oxygen gauge again. 9 minutes. I motioned for Amelia to enter the pod first, helping her maneuver through the narrow doorway. She settled into one of the seats, securing the harness across her chest. I took one last look around the minnow's cabin. This submersible had been my home for countless dives, a marvel of engineering that had taken us deeper than most humans would ever go. Now it was dying. Filling with the ocean it was designed to keep out. The Archelon continued its ascent, now about 50 m above us. Its massive shell blocked much of the dim light filtering down from above, creating a moving shadow over the seafloor. I pulled myself into the pod and sealed the hatch behind me. The interior was cramped but dry, with its own life support systems that kicked in automatically as the door sealed. I removed my dive mask, taking my first breath of dry air in what felt like hours. Amelia did the same, her face pale but determined. "We're really leaving the minnow behind," she said, her voice sounding strange after our silent underwater communication. "No choice," I replied, strapping myself into the second seat. "But we've got the samples and the data. That's what matters." "Will this thing actually work?" she asked, eyeing the controls skeptically. "It's designed for this exact scenario. Once we trigger separation, explosive bolts will fire and release us from the main structure. Then the propulsion system kicks in and shoots us straight to the surface." I didn't mention that these pods were rarely tested in real-world emergencies. Theory and practice often diverged in the deep ocean. "What about the sharks?" Amelia asked, glancing at the small sonar display built into the pod's control panel. "They're fixated on the Archelon now," I explained, pointing to their signatures circling the massive turtle. "Plus, we'll be moving too fast for them to track us. Different prey profile, different movement pattern. They won't even register us as food." "You hope?" she muttered. "I know," I said with more confidence than I felt. "The pod will reach ascending velocity within seconds. Nothing down here can catch us once we're moving." Water was beginning to seep into the pod through small imperfections in the seal. Nothing catastrophic, but a reminder that we needed to move quickly. The minnow's structural integrity was compromising even our emergency vessel. I entered the final sequence for the emergency separation. The computer asked for confirmation, flashing a warning that detachment was irreversible. "Last chance," I said to Amelia. "Once we release, there's no going back." She took a deep breath and nodded. "Do it." I pressed the confirm button. The computer began a countdown from 10. We braced ourselves against the seats, gripping the harnesses tightly. "Sen, R, E." A series of concussive thumps vibrated through the pod as the explosive bolts fired simultaneously, severing our connections to the dying minnow. For a moment, nothing happened. We floated in place, untethered but motionless. Then the propulsion system engaged with a roar. G-forces pushed us back into our seats as the pod shot upward through the water column. The pressure change made my ears pop painfully despite the pod's attempt to regulate internal pressure. Through the small viewport, I caught a final glimpse of the minnow below us, growing smaller as we ascended. Its lights flickered once more, then went dark completely. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment abandoned on the seafloor, along with the first physical evidence of living prehistoric marine life. At least we had our samples and data. Above us, the massive silhouette of the Archelon grew larger as we approached it from below. The turtle continued its own steady ascent, but our pod was rising much faster. We would overtake it within seconds. "Look at that," I breathed as we drew alongside the prehistoric creature. From this angle, with the faint light filtering from above, we could appreciate the true scale of the Archelon. Its shell alone was nearly 15 feet long, with flippers extending another 6 feet on each side. The creature's head swiveled slightly as we passed, its ancient eyes tracking our movement. "It's watching us," Amelia said, her voice hushed with awe. "Probably trying to figure out what we are," I replied. "Nothing like our pod has existed in its evolutionary history." We shot past the Archelon, leaving it behind. As our ascent continued, the water outside the viewport began to lighten from black to deep blue as we approached the sunlit zones of the ocean. The pressure gauge showed we had already risen to 120 meters, ascending far faster than any human should without decompression stops. "What about the bends?" Amelia asked, noticing the same readings. "The pod has an emergency recompression system," I explained. "It'll adjust internal pressure gradually, even though we're physically ascending quickly. We might still need medical attention when we reach the surface, but it should prevent the worst effects. The pod vibrated around us as it pushed against the increasing water resistance. Our speed had decreased slightly, but we were still rising rapidly. The sharks had disappeared entirely from our sonar range, too far below us to register anymore. I checked our trajectory on the navigation display. We were heading straight for the Grayson's last known coordinates, but I had no way of knowing if the vessel was still there. They might have initiated search and rescue protocols when we lost contact, or they might have been forced to relocate due to weather or other factors. "Do you think they're still waiting for us?" Amelia asked, apparently following the same train of thought. "Preston wouldn't leave," I said firmly. "Not without confirmation." The ascent continued, smooth and steady. Now that we'd passed the 100 meters mark, the water outside had lightened to a more vibrant blue, with actual sunlight visible as moving patterns through the water. I couldn't help glancing back down through the viewport, searching for any sign of the Archelon. The massive turtle had fallen far behind us, now just a dark shape in the depths. As I watched, I thought I could make out 3 smaller shapes circling it, the sharks still in pursuit. Part of me felt guilty for leaving the ancient creature to face those predators alone, though intellectually I knew that was absurd. The Archelon had survived in this ecosystem for who knows how long, possibly millions of years, if it truly was a living fossil. It had evolved alongside those sharks, or their ancestors. This was its world, not ours. The depth gauge passed 60 m, then 50. We were approaching the range where standard scuba divers might operate. The sunlight through the water was bright enough now that the pod's internal light seemed unnecessary. "Almost there," I said, more to myself than to Amelia. The pod's ascent rate had slowed considerably as we neared the surface. The propulsion system was designed for emergency escape from depth, not for controlled surfacing. The computer was automatically adjusting our speed to prevent us from breaching too violently. At 20 m, we could see the surface above us, a shimmering, undulating ceiling of light. No sign of the Grayson yet, but our viewing angle was limited through the small viewport. "Prepare for surface breach," I warned Amelia. "Could be rough depending on the sea state." She nodded, tightening her harness. We both braced ourselves as the pod rose through the final meters of water. The impact when we hit the surface was jarring, but not violent, more like a car hitting a speed bump than a collision. The pod bobbed in the waves, adjusting to the sudden absence of surrounding water pressure. Sunlight flooded through the viewport, startlingly bright. After hours in the ocean depths, I squinted against the glare, trying to spot the Grayson. For a moment, all I could see was open ocean and blue sky, no sign of our research vessel or any other boats. Then Amelia grabbed my arm. "There!" she shouted, pointing off to our right. About half a mile away, the distinctive white hull of the Grayson was visible, moving in our direction. They'd spotted us. I activated the pod's emergency beacon to make absolutely sure they could locate us, then sat back in my seat, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had kept me going through our ordeal began to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep fatigue. "We made it," Amelia said softly, her voice catching. "I didn't think we would." "Neither did I admitted. "Not after those sharks appeared." We sat in silence for a moment, watching the Grayson grow larger as it approached our position. The waves rocked our pod gently, a reminder that we were truly at the surface again. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Amelia finally asked. "About what we saw down there?" I thought about the samples we'd managed to salvage, the data recordings, the photographs, evidence of living prehistoric creatures in the modern ocean. It would change everything we thought we knew about evolution and extinction. "They'll have to," I replied. "We've got proof." I glanced back at the water spreading out around our pod. Somewhere deep below us, the Archelon continued its slow journey through an ocean that had been its home since the time of dinosaurs. Through the pod's small viewport, I caught a final glimpse of the ocean surface, knowing that beneath those waves, hidden in the deep, an entire ecosystem of living fossils continued to exist, unknown to science until today. I squinted through the ascent pod's small viewport, adjusting to the brightness after hours in the murky deep. The sun hit the water's surface in fractured patterns, almost painful to look at after so long in darkness. We'd made it. Actually made it. "Grayson, this is Ben. Do you read? Emergency ascent complete. Requesting immediate extraction." Static buzzed through the comm system. I adjusted the frequency and tried again, my fingers clumsy from cold and exhaustion. Grayson, this is Ben. Amelia and I are on the surface in the emergency pod. Do you copy? More static, but this time with fragments of voice breaking through. We were close to communication range, but not quite there. Try the emergency channel, she suggested, her voice muffled. I switched channels and repeated our call. Mayday, Mayday. This is Research Team Alpha, emergency ascent pod at surface coordinates. I read off the GPS display, hoping someone was listening. The static cleared suddenly, and a familiar voice broke through. Reading you, Ben. Is that really you? We thought. Grayson's voice crackled with relief. Grayson? Yes, it's us. Emergency extraction needed. The minnow is lost. What happened down there? We lost contact hours ago. Too much to explain now. We need pickup immediately. We have specimens that need containment. The radio crackled as Grayson responded. Copy that. The horizon is already en route to your position. ETA 12 minutes. What's your condition? Stable but cold. Pod integrity holding. I didn't mention our oxygen levels were critically low, or that we'd nearly drowned inside our own submersible. There'd be time for that later. Stand by, Ben. We're coming for you. I set down the handset and looked at Amelia. 12 minutes. She nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and disbelief. What are we going to tell them? The truth, I said. We have the evidence. We sat in silence for several minutes, the pod rocking gently on the surface swells. I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd witnessed, a living ecosystem of creatures that should have been extinct for millions of years, somehow thriving in the depths. The scientific implications were staggering. The horizon ahead broke with movement, the silhouette of the research vessel growing larger as it approached. I pointed it out to Amelia, who let out a long, shaky breath. Never thought I'd be so happy to see that ugly boat, she said with a weak smile. As the vessel drew closer, I picked up the radio again. Grayson, we have visual contact. Copy that. Prepare for pickup. Captain Noble has been briefed on your emergency status. I switched off the radio and turned to Amelia. When we get aboard, we need to secure those samples immediately. The temperature-sensitive materials need to go straight into cold storage. She nodded. And the photographs. Back them up the second we have access to a secure drive. Nobody touches anything until Preston sees it all. The horizon loomed larger now, and I could make out figures moving on deck preparing for our recovery. Martin Noble would be at the helm, his decades of experience evident in the precise way the vessel approached our small pod. Get ready, I told Amelia as I gathered our research materials. When that hatch opens, it's going to be chaos. The vessel slowed as it came alongside us, and I heard the thrum of its engines shifting to idle. A recovery team was visible on the starboard side, preparing to deploy the rescue cradle. I activated our locator beacon to make us more visible, though in the midday sun, our orange pod stood out clearly against the blue water. My heart pounded with a mixture of relief and anxiety. We were safe, or nearly so, but what came next might be even more challenging. We discovered something that would upend marine biology as we knew it, and managing that information properly would be crucial. The radio crackled again. Ben, this is Captain Noble. We're deploying recovery now. Stand by. I watched as the mechanical arm extended from the ship's side, lowering the recovery cradle toward our pod. The precision of the operation was impressive. Martin's crew worked with practiced efficiency. Almost home, I said to Amelia. She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the approaching cradle. I understood her silence. After what we'd seen, home felt like a complicated concept. We'd glimpsed a world that humans weren't supposed to know about, a secret ecosystem that had survived in isolation for millions of years. That knowledge changed things. The cradle made contact with our pod with a metallic clank, and I felt the mechanism lock into place. Slowly, the arm began to retract, lifting us from the water. The sudden motion made my stomach lurch, reminding me how long we'd been without food or proper rest. As we rose toward the deck, I caught glimpses of the crew, their expressions shifting from professional focus to visible relief when they spotted us alive inside the pod. I recognized several of Martin's team and nodded acknowledgement through the viewport. The cradle settled onto the deck with a gentle thud, and immediately crew members moved to secure it. Someone knocked on the viewport Grayson, his face lined with concern. I gave him a thumbs up and began the process of unlocking our hatch from the inside. The seal broke with a hiss of pressure, and suddenly the hatch was pulled open from outside. Bright sunlight flooded in, temporarily blinding me. The contrast from the dimness of the pod was jarring, and I raised a hand to shield my eyes. "Ben! Amelia!" Grayson's voice came through clearly now, no longer filtered through radio static. "Thank God. We thought you were gone." Hands reached in to help us out. My limbs were stiff from the cramped conditions, and I struggled to coordinate my movements. The crew lifted me onto the deck, where I stood unsteadily, blinking against the harsh daylight. The deck felt solid beneath my feet, almost too solid after hours of floating. I turned to help Amelia, but crew members were already assisting her from the pod. She clutched our sample case tightly to her chest, unwilling to relinquish it. "We need a secure containment unit for these samples," I said immediately, my voice rougher than I expected. "Temperature-controlled, sealed environment." Now, Grayson looked surprised at the urgency in my tone. "Ben, let's get you both checked out first. Medical is standing by." "The samples first," I insisted. "They're time-sensitive and irreplaceable." Martin Noble approached from the bridge, his weathered face creased with relief. "Hughes, good to see you in one piece. We've got the lab prepped as requested." I nodded gratefully. "Captain Noble, thanks for the pickup. Is Preston on board?" "Stevens?" "No, he's back at the Institute. We've got him on satellite phone if needed." "I need to speak with him immediately," I said. "We found something down there. Something impossible." Martin exchanged glances with Grayson, concern evident in their expressions. "Let's get you inside first," Martin said, motioning toward the main cabin. I hesitated, looking back at the pod. "The data drives. We need everything from the pod secured." "My team will handle it," Grayson assured me. "Nothing will be left behind." I reluctantly allowed myself to be led toward the cabin, keeping Amelia in my peripheral vision as she walked beside me, still clutching our samples. The crew parted to let us pass, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. I heard murmured questions about the minnow, about what had happened, but no one addressed us directly. Inside the main cabin, the air conditioning hit my skin like a shock. I hadn't realized how cold I was until that moment, and a violent shiver ran through me. Someone draped a thermal blanket over my shoulders. I accepted it automatically but remained standing. "The lab," I repeated. "We need to secure these samples now." "This way," Grayson said, leading us through the corridor toward the ship's small research lab. The lab was pristine, equipment humming quietly, ready for use. Amelia immediately moved to the containment unit and began the process of transferring our samples, her movements precise despite her exhaustion. "Can someone please get Preston on the line?" I asked, watching Amelia work. A crew member handed me a satellite phone. "It's connecting now." I took the phone, gathering my thoughts. "How do you tell your research director that you've discovered living prehistoric species that should have been extinct for 65 million years?" The line connected. "Stevens here. Preston, it's Ben." "Ben!" His voice shot up an octave. "What happened?" "We lost contact with the minnow hours ago. The emergency protocols were activated." "The minnow is gone," I interrupted. "But Amelia and I made it out with samples and data." "What happened?" he repeated, his tone more measured now. "We found something in the dead zone. Several somethings, actually." I paused, knowing how the next part would sound. "Living specimens of Cretaceous species. Preston, we found a Cretoxorina mantelli. 3 of them, actually, and an archelon. Alive." The silence on the line stretched for several seconds. "Ben," Preston finally said, "are you certain those species have been extinct for 65 million years?" "Yes, I'm aware." I glanced at Amelia, who was now setting up the digital transfer of our photographic evidence. "We have samples, Preston. Clear, unmistakable visual evidence." Another long pause. "I'll be on the next helicopter out. Don't share this with anyone else. No reports, no calls, no messages. Nothing leaves that boat until I get there." "Understood." "And Ben, are you both all right?" I hadn't even considered my own physical state. Now that he mentioned it, every muscle in my body ached and my lungs burned from the strain of breathing compressed air for too long. "We're functional," I said. "Nothing that can't wait." After ending the call, I turned to find a medical officer, waiting patiently nearby with a kit. I waved him off. "After we secure the evidence," I said firmly. Amelia had connected her camera to the lab's computer system and was transferring the images. I moved to stand beside her, watching as the photos appeared on screen. There they were, the unmistakable silhouettes of the Kretox arena, their prehistoric forms captured in stark digital clarity, and the Archelon, its massive shell dwarfing our submersible. "These are incredible," Grayson said from behind us, his voice hushed with awe. "If these are authentic..." "They're authentic," I said flatly. We were there. More crew members had gathered at the lab entrance, drawn by the commotion and rumors. Martin pushed through them, taking one look at the screen before turning to address his crew. "All right, everyone, back to stations. This is classified research material." As the crew reluctantly dispersed, a voice crackled over the ship's radio system. "Captain, we're picking up unusual seismic readings from the zone." Martin moved to the wall-mounted radio. "Define unusual." "Rhythmic pulses, sir. Not consistent with standard tectonic activity, and they're intensifying." I exchanged a glance with Amelia. "The underwater vents," I said. "They must be more active than we thought." Martin turned to me. "You observed volcanic activity down there?" "Not directly, but we found sulfur compounds, methane, signs of hydrothermal activity. It could explain the dead zone and possibly how these creatures have survived." "Isolated ecosystem," Amelia added, her voice stronger now. "Cut off from the rest of the ocean by chemical and temperature barriers." The implications were starting to crystallize in my mind. An isolated pocket of ocean, somehow preserved with conditions similar to the Cretaceous period, allowing these species to survive while the rest of the world evolved without them. Martin was conferring with his navigation officer about moving the ship to a safer distance from the zone. I finally allowed the medical officer to check my vitals, though my attention remained on the computer screen where Amelia continued to organize our findings. "Your oxygen levels are low," the medic informed me, "and you're showing signs of mild hypothermia and decompression stress. You need rest and observation." "Later," I said, "after Preston arrives." The remainder of the day passed in a blur of activity. We secured all samples, backed up all data, and prepared preliminary reports. I refused to lie down despite the medical team's insistence, running instead on adrenaline and coffee. By evening, Preston had arrived via helicopter, looking windblown and intensely focused. He barely greeted anyone before demanding to see the evidence. We gathered in the lab, where Amelia and I presented everything we'd collected. Preston examined the photographs in silence, occasionally asking pointed questions about scale, behavior, and interaction. When we described how the Archelon had inadvertently saved us, he removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "If this is verified, and I have no reason to doubt you both, it's the zoological discovery of the century." He looked up at us. "Possibly of any century." "The samples will confirm it," I said. "Tissue, water composition, everything." Preston nodded. "I've already arranged for a secure research team back at the Institute. Top-level clearance only." He hesitated. "The implications of this, Ben, this changes everything we thought we knew about extinction events, about evolutionary isolation." "I know," I said simply. After Preston had examined everything, he ordered both Amelia and me to get medical attention and rest. This time, I didn't argue. The adrenaline was wearing off, and exhaustion was setting in hard. But even after being checked over by the medical team and given a bunk to rest in, sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced with questions, theories, implications. Around midnight, I gave up trying and made my way back to the lab. To my surprise, the lights were already on. Amelia looked up from the microscope as I entered. "Couldn't sleep either?" I shook my head. "Too much to process." She gestured to the preliminary analysis results on the screen beside her. "Take a look at this." I moved closer, studying the readouts from our water samples. The chemical composition was unlike anything I'd seen in standard ocean water. Elevated levels of certain minerals, unusual organic compounds, and something else. Something that shouldn't be there. "Is that radiation?" Amelia confirmed. "Not dangerous levels, but definitely present, and it's not matching any known natural radiation pattern." I stared at the readings, pieces clicking into place in my mind. This could explain the isolation of the ecosystem, a radiation barrier. But where's it coming from? Natural uranium deposits shouldn't create this specific signature. I shook my head, the implications darkening my already complex feelings about our discovery. I don't know, but I think the dead zone isn't natural at all. Someone or something created it. Amelia looked at me, her expression troubled. What are we dealing with here, Ben? I had no answer for her. We'd gone looking for the cause of a mysterious dead zone and instead discovered living fossils that should have been extinct for millions of years. Now we were finding evidence of unnatural radiation patterns that defied explanation. I turned back to the readouts, studying the inexplicable data. The mystery of what we'd found was far deeper than either of us had imagined. I studied the radiation readings on the screen for the 5th time, trying to make sense of them. These patterns didn't match anything I'd seen before in 15 years of oceanographic research. The isotope concentrations were all wrong for modern seawater. This doesn't add up, I said, tapping my finger against the screen. These readings look more like, well, not like anything from our time. Amelia leaned closer, squinting at the data. What do you mean? Before I could answer, the lab door swung open. Preston Stevens walked in, his face tight with concern and what looked like annoyance. He'd made it from the mainland in record time after our call, which wasn't surprising. When the Institute's most expensive submersible gets abandoned at the bottom of the ocean, people tend to move quickly. Hughes, he said, skipping any greeting. Start from the beginning, all of it. I straightened up, feeling the stiffness in my back from hunching over the equipment for hours. I've sent you the preliminary data, but there's more. We found living specimens, Preston. Creatures that should have been extinct for millions of years. Preston's expression didn't change. You found unusual marine life. That's not unprecedented. No, you're not hearing me. We didn't find unusual marine life. We found Cretoxorhina mantelli, the Cretaceous great white, and an adult archelon, perfectly preserved specimens of animals that went extinct with the dinosaurs. He crossed his arms. That's not possible. I know what I saw. I've got the footage. The tissue samples. What you've got is extraordinary, yes, Preston cut in. But the leap you're making is beyond scientific reasoning. There are dozens of explanations more likely than actual prehistoric specimens. I pulled up the video footage Amelia had taken. The images were grainy and dark, but clear enough to make out the distinctive features of the shark as it circled and struck our submersible. Tell me what else this could be, I challenged. Preston leaned in, studying the footage. An unknown species, a genetic anomaly, maybe even a hoax someone engineered. All more plausible than your Lazarus taxon theory. A hoax? Who would or even could engineer multiple 60-foot predators and drop them into the middle of the Pacific? Preston, I'm just saying we need to be methodical. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which is exactly why we need to go back, I said, feeling my frustration build. We need to return with better equipment, a larger team. This could be the most significant biological discovery of the century. The minnow is at the bottom of the ocean, and you want me to authorize another expedition when we don't even understand what happened to cause the first disaster? Preston shook his head. That's not happening. So what? We just ignore this? I waved my hand at the screen. There's an expanding dead zone with living prehistoric creatures in it. This changes everything we understand about evolution. Extinction events. What it changes, Preston interrupted sharply, is nothing. Until we've done proper analysis. I need actual verified data, not wild speculation based on a traumatic experience in a failing submersible with compromised oxygen levels. His implication was clear, and it made my blood boil. You think we hallucinated this? I asked. I think you experienced something unusual, and your interpretation is colored by stress and oxygen deprivation. Amelia, who had stayed quiet through our exchange, finally spoke up. Dr. Stevens, I recorded the footage myself. The samples we collected don't match anything in our database. The oxygen levels in the submersible were monitored throughout the dive. We were frightened, yes, but we weren't hallucinating. Preston rubbed his forehead. I'm not dismissing your experience. I'm saying we need to analyze what we have before jumping to conclusions that would upend established science. I took a breath, trying to find a more productive approach. That's exactly what I'm doing. Give me 24 hours with the samples we collected. Let me show you what we found. Preston hesitated, then nodded. Fine, you have a day, but keep this contained until we have something concrete. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. And Hughes, no outside communications about this, to anyone. After he left, I turned back to the samples, trying to channel my frustration into something useful. He'll come around, Amelia said, not sounding entirely convinced. He will when I prove it to him, I replied, pulling up another set of data on the screen. For the next few hours, I analyzed the water samples we'd collected from various depths within the dead zone. The results only deepened the mystery. The water contained trace elements and mineral compositions that didn't match modern ocean chemistry. I ran the test 3 times to be sure. The levels of iridium and certain sulfur isotopes were elevated in patterns I'd only seen in geological samples dated to the late Cretaceous period. It was as if we'd collected water from an ocean that existed 65 million years ago. Amelia had gone to rest, but I couldn't step away from the lab. These findings weren't just unusual, they were impossible. Modern oceans had different chemical signatures due to billions of years of biological processes and geological changes. Yet here was water with chemistry that matched ancient oceanic compositions. I was still staring at the results when Grayson Daniels knocked on the open lab door. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, handing me a tablet. "Just came in from the satellite feed." The screen showed thermal imaging of the dead zone we'd been studying. The blue area, indicating decreased biological activity, had expanded noticeably. "Is this current?" I asked, zooming in on the image. "Taken an hour ago," Grayson confirmed. "The dead zone has grown almost half a mile since yesterday's reading." I sat back in my chair, processing this information. That's too fast for natural spread. That's what I thought. Captain Noble wants to know if we should increase our distance from the perimeter. I shook my head. No. We need to stay close, but keep the engines ready for a quick exit if needed. After Grayson left, I pulled up the geological surveys of the area. There wasn't much. This part of the Pacific hadn't been mapped in detail because it wasn't near any major shipping lanes or known geological features of interest. But something was happening down there. The expansion of the dead zone, the water chemistry, the creatures we'd seen, they were all connected. I pulled up seismic data from the past month and noticed small, consistent tremors in the region. Too minor to trigger any alerts, but forming a pattern when viewed collectively. My mind raced with a new theory. What if there was underwater geological activity that had somehow exposed an isolated ecosystem? A trench or cave system that had been sealed off for millions of years, preserving an ancient environment. It seemed far-fetched, but no more so than living Cretaceous predators swimming around the modern Pacific. I needed to consult someone who knew more about prehistoric marine life than I did. Despite Preston's warning about outside communications, I knew exactly who to call. I dialed Asher Powell's number. He picked up on the third ring, his British accent crisp despite the poor connection. "Hughes? To what do I owe the pleasure? It's rather late, isn't it?" "Sorry about the time, Asher. I need your expertise on something urgent," I said, keeping my voice down despite being alone in the lab. "Oh? Sounds intriguing. I need you to look at some images. I'll send them over our secure server, but I need your immediate reaction, and this stays between us for now." Mysterious as ever. "Very well. Send them through." I uploaded the clearest still images we had of the Cretoxyrina and the Archelon, then waited while Asher received them. The silence that followed told me everything. "Asher, you there?" "My word," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Are these genuine?" "That's what I'm hoping you can tell me. What do you see?" "Well, if these are authentic, this first specimen is clearly Cretoxyrina mantelli. The dentition is unmistakable, and the body morphology matches perfectly with our fossil records. And this appears to be an adult Archelon." He paused. "Ben, where did these images come from?" "We encountered them yesterday at the site we've been investigating. Amelia and I were in the minnow when they attacked us." Another long silence. "That's not possible." "That's what Preston said. But I saw them, Asher. I've got water samples with chemistry that matches Cretaceous oceans. Something impossible is happening out here." "The preservation of physical traits," Asher muttered. thinking aloud. It's perfect. Too perfect for convergent evolution or a modern relative. If these creatures existed in an isolated environment for millions of years, they should show evolutionary adaptations, but these look identical to our fossil records. So you're saying they can't have evolved naturally from the Cretaceous era to now? I'm saying that if they did, they should look different after millions of years of adaptation, unless they were somehow preserved exactly as they were, some form of stasis. I thought about the radiation patterns we'd detected. What if the area they're in somehow maintained Cretaceous conditions? A sealed ecosystem that's only recently been exposed? Highly unlikely, but Asher's voice trailed off. If you're right, this would be the most significant paleontological discovery in history. After finishing my call with Asher, I pulled up the nautical maps of the region and began plotting the coordinates where we'd taken samples, overlaying them with the expanding boundaries of the dead zone. When I added the locations of the minor seismic activities, a pattern emerged. The dead zone was expanding along what appeared to be a previously unmapped trench system. The geological data was sparse, but when combined with our bathymetric readings, it suggested a network of deep trenches radiating from a central point precisely where we'd encountered the prehistoric creatures. It was nearly midnight when I finally left the lab, my eyes burning from staring at screens for hours. I needed sleep if I was going to make a compelling case to Preston tomorrow. The gentle rocking of the ship usually helped me sleep, but that night it felt different, more erratic. I had just drifted off when a violent jolt threw me from my bunk onto the floor. For a moment I thought I was still dreaming. Then another tremor shook the ship, stronger than the first, and I heard items crashing to the floor in my cabin. The ship's alarm began to wail. I grabbed a sweatshirt and shoes and hurried into the corridor, where crew members were already rushing to their emergency stations. "What's happening?" I asked a passing technician. "Seismic activity," she said over her shoulder. "Captains ordered everyone to secure stations." Another tremor hit, this one lasting several seconds. I made my way to the bridge, holding on to railings as the ship pitched. Captain Noble was at the helm, talking rapidly into the radio. "Hughes," he acknowledged when he saw me. "We've got unexpected seismic events. Nothing on the warning systems until they hit." "Where's the epicenter?" I asked. He pointed to the navigation screen. "Right where your dead zone is. Started about 10 minutes ago." I looked at the readings. These weren't minor tremors anymore. They were registering 5.7, 6.1 on the Richter scale. Yet they weren't following normal earthquake patterns. "I need to see this," I said, already turning toward the door. "Hughes, we're in lockdown," Noble called after me, but I was already heading for the deck. I pushed through the heavy door to the outside, immediately hit by the cool night air. The sky was clear, stars visible in breathtaking clarity this far from shore, but my attention went straight to the water. What I saw made me freeze. The ocean around the ship was glowing, not in the way bioluminescent algae sometimes does. This was different. Patterns of blue-green light pulsed beneath the surface, spreading outward in geometric shapes that seemed too regular to be natural. As I watched, another tremor shook the ship, and at the exact same moment, the light patterns intensified and shifted, pulsing in perfect synchronization with the seismic activity. It wasn't random. The bioluminescence was responding to the tremors, or perhaps triggering them. The patterns expanded and contracted in rhythm, creating shapes that reminded me of mathematical sequences rather than natural phenomena. I stood at the railing, gripping it tightly as the ship rocked, unable to look away from the impossible light show surrounding us. Whatever we had discovered, whatever was happening beneath us, it wasn't just a preserved pocket of ancient life. It was something active, something responding, something that might not be natural at all. I tore my eyes away from the pulsing blue-green patterns in the water, forcing myself to focus. The ship continued to rock beneath my feet, but the strange light had captured everyone's attention now. Crew members rushed to the railings, pointing and calling out to each other. Their voices sounded distant through the rush of blood in my ears. My watch showed 3:17 a.m. I'd been standing there for nearly 20 minutes, transfixed by the impossible display below us. The patterns weren't random. They moved with purpose, expanding and contracting in rhythm. Whatever was happening, it responded to the seismic activity with mathematical precision. The PA system crackled to life. All research personnel, report to the conference room immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, all research personnel to the conference room immediately. Captain Noble's voice carried an edge I hadn't heard before. In 15 years at sea, I'd learned to recognize the tones of genuine urgency from experienced captains. This was one of those moments. I made my way to the conference room, passing crew members securing equipment as another tremor shook the vessel. The halls were bright with emergency lighting, making everything feel clinical and stark. When I reached the conference room, Amelia was already there, hunched over her laptop with dark circles under her eyes. She looked up as I entered, nodding once before returning to her screen. Captain Noble stood at the head of the table, his weathered face grim. Preston Stevens sat beside him, flipping through a folder of printouts with quick, agitated movements. 4 other research team members were scattered around the table, their faces pale with exhaustion and concern. "Hughes, good," Noble said as I took a seat. "Now we're all here. I'll get straight to it. We're evacuating the research zone. The seismic activity has become too unstable for us to remain safely in position. My responsibility is the safety of this ship and everyone aboard it." The words hit me like a physical blow. Evacuating. "We can't leave now. This isn't up for debate," Noble replied, his Scottish accent thickening as it always did under stress. The last tremor registered at 5.4, and they're increasing in both frequency and intensity. "When?" I asked, leaning forward. "We begin preparations at dawn. I want us underway by noon tomorrow." I looked around the table, searching for allies. The other researchers avoided my gaze, already resigned to the decision. "Captain, we're witnessing something unprecedented," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "The bioluminescent activity, the radiation patterns, the seismic readings, they're all connected to what we found down there." Preston cleared his throat. "Ezra, I understand your enthusiasm, but Captain Noble is right. We've already lost one submersible, and the risks are escalating. We can analyze what we've collected once we're back at the Institute." I pulled out my tablet and placed it on the table. "What we've collected barely scratches the surface. Look at these readings." I swiped through the graphs showing the radiation patterns we've been tracking for the past 8 hours. They're increasing in direct proportion to the seismic activity. This isn't just some random correlation. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Preston asked, his voice carrying that familiar tone of skepticism. I took a deep breath. This was the moment to lay out the theory that had been forming in my mind since we'd returned to the surface. It sounded crazy even to me, but the evidence kept pointing in the same direction. "I believe we've discovered an area of the seabed that's somehow reverting to prehistoric conditions," I said. "The dead zone isn't just killing modern marine life. It's recreating an environment from the late Cretaceous period." The silence that followed was profound. Preston stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Captain Noble's expression remained neutral, but I saw his eyes narrow slightly. "That's impossible," one of the junior researchers muttered. "Is it?" I pulled up the images of the Cretoxorina and the Archelon. "How do you explain these? Perfect specimens of creatures extinct for over 70 million years? And they weren't fossils. They were alive, hunting, behaving exactly as paleobiologists theorized they would have. Convergent evolution," Preston suggested. "Modern species that evolved similar traits." I shook my head. "Not possible. The genetic testing we ran on the sample shows DNA patterns consistent with what we'd expect from Cretaceous-era marine life. And the water chemistry in the samples matches perfectly with what we know about ocean composition during that period." "Ezra," Preston said carefully, "you're making an extraordinary leap based on limited data. Even if these are somehow previously undiscovered species that resemble prehistoric life forms, that doesn't mean the ocean floor is time-traveling." "Not time-traveling," I corrected. "I think it's more like displacement. Something is causing that section of the ocean to revert to its state from millions of years ago." Amelia looked up from her laptop. "The shell fragments," she said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. "The ammonite shell fragments we recovered," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I've completed the analysis. They're not just similar to Cretaceous specimens. They're identical, down to the microscopic growth patterns and trace mineral composition. She turned her laptop so everyone could see the screen showing side-by-side comparisons of our sample with museum specimens. "And there's more," she added. "The sediment samples from the seafloor contain microorganisms that don't match anything in our modern databases, but they do match fossilized specimens from the late Cretaceous." Captain Noble frowned. "Even if what you're saying is true, that only strengthens my resolve to evacuate. We're dealing with unknown forces that are clearly dangerous. Or we're witnessing the most important scientific discovery of our lifetime," I countered. "Something that could revolutionize our understanding of marine ecology, evolution, and possibly physics itself." I turned to Preston, changing tactics. "Just one more dive. Let me take the backup submersible down for a closer look. A quick reconnaissance mission before we leave. If what I suspect is happening down there is real, we need better documentation." Preston exchanged glances with Captain Noble. "The backup submersible isn't rated for the depths where you encountered those creatures." "It doesn't need to be," I said. "The fissures causing the seismic activity appear to be rising. The glowing patterns we're seeing are much closer to the surface than where we originally encountered the creatures. I believe the phenomenon is expanding upward." I showed them the data on my tablet, pointing out the changes in depth readings over the past 12 hours. 4 hours, I said. "That's all I'm asking for. One dive with the backup submersible, better cameras, improved sensors. We get what we can, and then we leave, if that's still the decision." Preston rubbed his temples, clearly torn between scientific curiosity and caution. Captain Noble remained stoic, his arms crossed over his chest. "The backup submersible has better structural integrity," Amelia added, "and improved emergency systems. If anything goes wrong, the ascent mechanisms are more reliable." I nodded gratefully in her direction. "I'll go alone. No need to risk anyone else." "Absolutely not," Noble said. "Solo dives violate protocol." "Under normal circumstances, yes," I agreed. "But these aren't normal circumstances, and I'm the most experienced diver on board. I've logged more submersible hours than anyone here." The room fell silent again as Preston and Noble considered my proposal. I could see the junior researchers watching the exchange with wide eyes, probably wondering if I'd gone mad. Finally, Preston spoke. 4 hours, not a minute more. And you maintain constant communication with the surface. Any sign of trouble, anything at all, and you abort immediately." "Agreed," I said quickly before he could change his mind. Captain Noble's expression darkened. "I want on record that I object to this decision, but I'll coordinate with the dive team to prepare the backup submersible." "Thank you, Captain," I said. "I'll need the enhanced sensor package installed in the new high-resolution camera system." "You'll have it," Preston said. "But Ezra, listen to me carefully. This isn't about proving a theory. Get in, document what you can, and get out. No unnecessary risks." I nodded, already mentally preparing for what I might find below. The meeting broke up shortly after that. As people filed out, Amelia caught my arm. "You realize what you're saying, right?" she asked quietly. "If you're correct about this, it changes everything we understand about temporal stability." "I know, I saw," I replied. "That's why we can't just leave." "Be careful down there," she said, her eyes serious. "Whatever's happening, it's getting stronger." I thanked her for backing me up and headed to the equipment bay to prepare for the dive. The technicians were already at work on the backup submersible, a newer model called the Tern. Smaller than the Minnow, but with more advanced systems. I spent the next 2 hours helping them install the specialized equipment I'd need, checking and double-checking every connection. By the time dawn broke, casting pale light through the launch bay windows, we were ready. I suited up methodically, running through mental checklists I'd developed over years of dives. The weight of what I was about to do settled on me, not just the physical danger, but the potential significance of what I might discover. The launch team helped me into the Tern's cockpit. Unlike the Minnow, which had room for two, the Tern was designed for a single operator, with all controls within easy reach. The space was tight but efficient, packed with displays and instrumentation. "Communications check," came Grayson's voice through the headset as I settled in. "Receiving you clearly," I replied, adjusting the volume. "Surface team standing by. All systems show green. Captain Noble wants a final confirmation that you understand the parameters of this dive. 4 hours maximum. Constant communication. Aboard at the first sign of trouble, I recited. Confirmed. Commencing launch sequence. I felt the familiar sensation of movement as the cradle carrying the turn shifted toward the launch doors. Water sprayed against the viewport as we moved into position. I took a deep breath, centering myself. Whatever was waiting down there, I was about to get a much closer look. The launch sequence completed, and I felt the momentary disorientation as the turn dropped into the ocean. I activated the external lights and began my descent, watching the depth gauge tick steadily downward. The familiar blue of the upper ocean gradually darkened around me. Passing 100 mi, I reported. All systems nominal. Acknowledged, came Preston's voice. He must have taken over from Grayson. Any unusual readings? Nothing yet, I replied, scanning the instrument panels. Water clarity is normal, no sign of bioluminescence at this depth. I continued downward, monitoring the sonar display for any large objects. The water outside the viewport remained ordinary, filled with the usual marine snow and occasional fish. 200 meter, I reported. Wait, something's changing. The quality of the water was shifting. Instead of becoming murkier as I descended, it seemed to be getting clearer. Particles in the water were beginning to emit a faint glow. I'm seeing the first signs of the phenomenon, I said into the comm. Bioluminescent particles similar to what we observed from the surface, but more dispersed at this depth. Radiation readings? Preston asked. I checked the sensor. Slight elevation, nothing concerning yet. By the time I reached 250 m, the change was unmistakable. The water had a crystalline quality I'd never seen at this depth. Visibility extended much further than should have been possible. The particles glowing in the water seemed to move with purpose, not just drifting with the currents but forming subtle patterns. 300 mi, I announced. The visibility is extraordinary. I can see at least 30 m in all directions. Then I noticed the sonar display. Large signatures were moving below me, massive shapes circling in a slow, deliberate pattern. I'm picking up significant biological activity, I reported, my pulse quickening. Multiple large organisms moving in formation, approximately 50 m below my position. Can you identify them? Preston's voice had an edge to it now. Not yet. The sonar suggests they're between 5 and 8 meters in length, consistent with the creepypasta we encountered previously. I adjusted my descent angle, moving slightly away from the signatures. As fascinating as they were, I had no desire to repeat our previous encounter with the prehistoric sharks. The luminous particles were growing more numerous now, creating a soft, diffuse light that complemented my external lamps. I decided to collect a sample, carefully maneuvering the turn's external collection arm to capture some of the glowing material in a specimen container. Sample collected at 320 m, I reported. The particles appear to be organic in nature, but unlike any bioluminescent organisms I'm familiar with. Acknowledged, Preston replied. Temperature readings? I checked the external thermometer. That's odd. The temperature is rising, not falling. We're at 22 degrees Celsius. That's about 10 degrees warmer than it should be at this depth. The clarity of the water continued to improve as I descended. By 350 m, it was like looking through perfectly clean glass. The blue-green glow from the particles provided enough light that I could have switched off my external lamps. Approaching 400 mi, I said. The radiation sensor is showing increasing activity, still within safe parameters, but definitely elevated. Be careful, Ezra, Preston warned. You're approaching the maximum rated depth for the turn. Understood. I'm going to level off at 400. And the words died in my throat as I saw it. Below me, perhaps 50 meters further down, a massive fissure had opened in the ocean floor. It stretched as far as I could see in both directions, a jagged wound in the earth. But what made me stare in disbelief was the light, a pulsing, electric blue that emanated from deep within the crack. The light pulsed in a rhythm that matched exactly the patterns we'd observed from the surface. And the creatures. They were everywhere. Preston, I said, my voice barely steady. I found it. A fissure in the seabed, at least half a kilometer long, maybe longer. It's emitting some kind of energy blue light that pulses in regular intervals. I activated the high-resolution camera, capturing footage of what I was seeing. There are dozens of marine organisms around the fissure. I can confirm multiple creepypasta, at least 2 archelon, and I think those are Elasmosaurus, long-necked marine reptiles, and smaller creatures, two fish species I can't identify, but consistent with Cretaceous-era specimens. I watched in awe as the creatures swam in and out of the blue light, seemingly unaffected by it. They moved with purpose, some hunting, others simply navigating the currents. The radiation readings are spiking, I reported, noting the sensor with alarm. They're still within survivable ranges, but climbing steadily. I maneuvered the turn closer, careful to maintain a safe distance from both the fissure and the creatures. Through the viewport, I could see that the fissure wasn't static. It seemed to be widening slightly with each pulse of blue energy. I think the fissure is expanding with the seismic activity, I said. Each tremor widens it further. I took more photographs, documenting everything I could. The high-resolution camera captured details I knew would be invaluable. The texture of the creature's skin, the patterns of their movement, the precise quality of the light emerging from the fissure. The energy from the fissure appears to be creating a bubble of altered conditions. I continued. Inside this bubble, the environment mimics what we believe existed during the late Cretaceous period. Warmer water, different chemical composition, and somehow the life forms themselves. As I watched, a school of small iridescent fish swam directly through the blue light, emerging on the other side seemingly unchanged. The fissure wasn't harming the creatures, it was sustaining them. I'm going to take radiation readings at varying distances from the fissure, I said, carefully maneuvering the turn in a widening spiral pattern. The readings increase the closer I get to. A sudden, intense pulse of blue light erupted from the fissure, brighter than any before. The turn systems flickered, and several warning lights flashed on the control panel. "What's happening?" Preston's voice came through, distorted with static. "Massive energy surge from the fissure," I replied, working quickly to stabilize the submersible systems. "I'm experiencing electrical interference. Several systems are fluctuating." The lights in the cabin dimmed, then returned to normal. The navigation display reset itself briefly, showing nonsensical coordinates before recalibrating. "The fissure is pulsing more rapidly now," I reported. "The intervals between energy releases are decreasing." Another surge, stronger than the last. This time the communication system cut out entirely, returning after several seconds of silence. "Repeat, begin ascent immediately." Preston's voice came through, broken by static. Catastrophic. The rest dissolved into electronic noise. "Surface command, I can barely hear you," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Please repeat instructions." I adjusted the receiver gain, hoping to clarify the transmission, but it only increased the static. The red emergency lighting bathed the cabin in an apocalyptic glow that matched the growing sense of dread in my stomach. Movement outside the viewport caught my attention. Not the sharks from before, something new. I leaned forward, focusing on a dark shape emerging from the pulsing light of the fissure, then another, and another. "Holy," I whispered, forgetting the comm was open. The creatures moved with purpose, their forms becoming clearer as they approached. Long, streamlined bodies with distinctive crests and wing-like appendages. Even with my years of paleontological study, seeing living Rhamphorhynchus was almost beyond comprehension. The flying reptiles propelled themselves through the water with powerful strokes before angling upward. "Surface command," I said, my voice tight with controlled urgency. "I'm observing multiple specimens of what appear to be Rhamphorhynchus Jurassic period pterosaurs emerging from the fissure and heading toward the surface. This is not an isolated incident or misidentification. We're witnessing a mass emergence event." More broken transmissions came through. "To return immediately. Static. To unstable conditions." The temperature warning flashed red on the monitor. External hull temperature was rising rapidly, already past 60 degrees Celsius. At this rate, the structural integrity would be compromised within minutes. The submersible wasn't designed to withstand this kind of heat. The internal cabin temperature was climbing too, making sweat bead across my forehead. I glanced at the sensor readings again. We drifted another 20 meters closer to the fissure while I was distracted. Whatever was pulling us in was getting stronger. "No choice," I muttered, reaching for the emergency systems panel. I flipped open the clear plastic cover and punched in the authorization code. The emergency thruster system was our last resort. It would drain our remaining power reserves, but staying here meant certain death. The cabin lights dimmed further as power diverted to the emergency system. I gripped the manual override controls with both hands. The moment the system indicated readiness, I pushed the thrusters to maximum output. The submersible shuddered violently. For several terrifying seconds, nothing changed. We continued our inexorable drift toward the fissure. Then slowly, agonizingly, our movement began to slow. "Come on," I urged, as if the submersible could hear me. I watched the navigation display, willing the drift indicator to reverse. The hull temperature continued to rise 74 degrees now. Warning alarms competed for attention, creating a cacophony that made it nearly impossible to think. The drift indicator finally stopped. For one breathless moment, we hung suspended in the water, neither advancing nor retreating. Then gradually, the numbers began to change. We were moving away from the fissure. "Surface command," I reported. "Emergency thrusters engaged." Beginning to break free of. The rest of my sentence died in my throat. The fissure pulsed, the blue light intensifying to blinding white. I raised my arm to shield my eyes, but it didn't help. The light penetrated everything, filling the cabin with impossible brightness. Then came the pressure wave. It slammed into the submersible like a giant's hand, sending us tumbling through the water. I was thrown against the restraint harness, the breath knocked from my lungs. Multiple systems went offline simultaneously as circuit breakers tripped. The control panel sparked, and acrid smoke filled the cabin. We were spinning, rolling, completely out of control. My head struck something hard. The auxiliary control panel, I thought dimly. The world started to fade, darkness creeping in from the edges of my vision. I fought to stay conscious, reaching blindly for any control that might stabilize our descent, but it was no use. The last thing I remembered was the sensation of being pushed upward at incredible speed. And then nothing. I don't know how long I was out. Seconds, maybe minutes. Consciousness returned in fragments. First, the sound of alarms. Then the feeling of my body hanging awkwardly in the restraint harness. My head throbbed, and something warm trickled down my temple. I blinked, trying to clear my vision. The emergency lights flickered, casting intermittent illumination through the smoke-filled cabin. I checked the depth gauge. 300 meters and rapidly. We were in an uncontrolled ascent, spinning in a tight spiral. This was bad, very bad. Ascending too quickly would cause decompression sickness, potentially fatal. I needed to slow our ascent rate, but most systems were offline. I tried the backup controls, relieved when they responded sluggishly to my input. I couldn't stop our ascent completely, but I managed to slow our rotation and stabilize our attitude. My next concern was the hull integrity. The temperature readings had dropped from their dangerous highs, but the pressure sensors showed potential compromise in 2 sections. If the hull failed before we reached the surface, I pushed the thought aside. One problem at a time, 200 meters. The ascent had slowed somewhat, but was still faster than safe decompression protocols. I checked the emergency breathing apparatus. At least that was functional. I'd need it if we survived this ascent. I tried the comm system again. "Surface command, this is Turn. Emergency ascent in progress. Hull integrity compromised. Please respond." Nothing but static. Either the communications were completely down or something was interfering with the signal. 150 m. I looked up through the viewport. The water was changing, becoming more turbulent. Light filtered down from above, but not the normal gradual brightening of approaching the surface. This was chaotic, flashing, like lightning in a storm. I checked the external cameras. The view was distorted and fragmented, but I could make out enough to realize what was happening. The ocean surface was churning violently, waves forming and crashing in patterns I'd never witnessed before. 100 meters. The hull groaned as we continued our spiral ascent. I braced myself against the control panel, trying to maintain control with the few systems still responding. A dark shadow passed across the viewport, large and fast. Then another. The external camera caught it more Ramphorhynchus, dozens of them now, shooting upward like arrows toward the surface. 75 m. The turbulence increased dramatically. The submersible pitched and yawed despite my best efforts to maintain stability. The water outside looked wrong. Pockets of it seemed to be actually boiling, releasing clouds of bubbles that further obscured visibility. "What the hell is happening up there?" I whispered to myself. 50 m. I could make out the surface now, a roiling, frothing barrier between worlds. Something large broke through from below. I caught only a glimpse, but it appeared to be an enormous marine reptile, possibly a mosasaur breaching like a whale before crashing back into the turbulence. 25 m. I secured myself as best I could, tightening the harness straps and preparing for a rough surfacing. The external temperature sensors registered a bizarre pattern, areas of near-freezing water interspersed with pockets of extreme heat. 10 m. The spinning had increased again despite my efforts. We were going to break the surface in an uncontrolled tumble. "Brace for impact," I said aloud, though there was no one to hear me. We hit the surface hard. The submersible went airborne for a moment before crashing back down with enough force to rattle my teeth. Water sloshed over the viewport as we bobbed violently in what felt like the center of a hurricane. When the viewport cleared, I saw hell on water. The research vessel Horizon listed heavily to port about 200 meters away, massive waves breaking over its deck. Crew members scrambled across the tilting surface, some securing equipment, while others prepared the lifeboats. The sky above was dark with storm clouds that had appeared from nowhere, and through gaps in the cloud cover, flying shapes circled and dove. The Rhamphorhynchus had reached the surface, dozens of them now visible. Their leathery wings spread wide as they caught air currents. They weren't alone. Larger pterosaurs that I recognized as pteranodons soared among them, their distinctive crests silhouetted against the turbulent sky. The radio crackled suddenly to life. "Hughes! Come in, Hughes." I grabbed the handset. "This is Hughes. I'm on the surface, approximately 200 meters off your port side." "Thank God." It was Captain Noble's voice, strained but steady. "We're sending the recovery team. Hang tight." "What's happening?" I asked, watching as another wave, easily 15 meters high, crashed against the Horizon's hull. "All hell broke loose about 10 minutes after you lost contact," Noble replied. "Seismic activity off the charts. Then these things started appearing. We need to get out of here. Now." A lifeboat dropped from the Horizon's davits, its electric motor immediately engaged as it headed in my direction. I could make out 4 crew members aboard, all in survival suits. "The fissure," I said. "It's expanding, isn't it? Creating some kind of gateway. We can discuss theories once you're aboard and we're clear of this nightmare." Noble responded. "Recovery team ETA 1 minute." I gathered my data drives and the few samples I'd managed to collect before everything went sideways. The submersible rocked violently as another wave passed beneath us. I braced myself against the control panel, watching the recovery boat approach. They pulled alongside with impressive skill, given the conditions. 2 crew members secured lines too. I adjusted my tie for the 3rd time in 15 minutes. The stiff collar of my dress shirt felt like it was trying to choke me, a far cry from the comfortable expedition wear I'd lived in for months. The conference room of the National Oceanic Research Center had all the warmth of a surgical theater, gleaming surfaces, bright lights, and 12 pairs of eyes fixed on me with clinical interest. 3 weeks had passed since I'd bobbed on rough waters, clutching data drives while waiting for rescue. 3 weeks of debriefings, medical evaluations, and closed-door meetings that seemed to multiply rather than conclude. And now the culmination, this panel of stern-faced officials, arranged in a horseshoe formation before me. "Dr. Hughes, please continue with your assessment of the water samples," said Dr. Wainwright, the silver-haired oceanographer heading the scientific portion of the panel. I tapped my tablet, bringing up the chemical analysis on the wall-sized screen behind me. The water composition from within the zone shows elevated levels of sulfur compounds and iridium consistent with late Cretaceous ocean chemistry. I pointed to the comparison charts. We ran these tests multiple times to confirm. The isotopic ratios match samples we've taken from Cretaceous-era geological deposits. A woman in an Air Force uniform, Colonel Jennings, according to her nameplate, leaned forward. "And you're certain this isn't contamination from underwater volcanic activity?" "We considered that initially," I said, advancing to the next slide. But volcanic activity wouldn't explain the precise match to Cretaceous period chemistry across multiple compounds. More importantly, it doesn't explain this. I brought up the footage from the Tern's external cameras. Even now, watching it for perhaps the 30th time, I felt my pulse quicken. The massive shape of a mosasaur swam through the frame, its powerful tail propelling it past my submersible with terrible grace. "This specimen matches Tylosaurus proriger in every detail," I said, freezing the frame and highlighting anatomical features. "Not approximately, not similarly. Exactly." General Harmon, a square-jawed man with close-cropped gray hair, removed his glasses. "Dr. Hughes, we've had experts examining these videos. Some suggest these could be unknown deep-sea species that evolved convergently to resemble prehistoric animals." I expected this argument. It had been the standard pushback since our return. "That would be an extraordinary coincidence, General. We're talking about multiple species, all matching extinct creatures from the same time period, right down to scale patterns and dentition." I switched to another clip showing the Rhamphorhynchus emerging from the fissure. And these aren't just any prehistoric creatures. They're specifically from the late Cretaceous period, exactly matching the water chemistry we found. Dr. Wainwright studied the footage. "The flying reptiles are particularly troubling to explain away," he admitted. "We have no modern analogs for vertebrates with that wing structure." I nodded, grateful for the support. "More importantly, we have this." I pulled up the satellite imagery taken over the past 3 weeks. This is the area we identified as the dead zone during our initial research. The images showed a progression. First, the blue-green bioluminescence I'd witnessed, then increasing turbulence, and finally, in the most recent images, what appeared to be a landmass breaking the surface. "What we're seeing is unprecedented," I said, zooming in on the newest formations. "This isn't volcanic activity. The composition analysis shows organic material making up much of the surface area. It's as if an entire ecosystem is emerging from the ocean floor." The room grew quiet. I'd been showing them pieces of evidence, but this was the whole picture, undeniable and world-changing. Dr. Nakamura, a geologist on the panel, broke the silence. "The dating on these formations? That's the most fascinating part," I answered, bringing up another chart. "The new landmass contains plant matter and soil samples that carbon date to approximately 70 million years ago." Colonel Jennings made a note on her tablet. "The area has been completely restricted. No civilian vessels within 50 miles of the site." This was news to me. 50 miles? That's a massive quarantine. "It's necessary," General Harmon cut in. "The official statement cites environmental hazards. The public has been told there's been an underwater volcanic event with potential toxic gas emissions." I didn't like that. "So you're hiding this?" "We're proceeding with caution," Dr. Wainwright corrected. "Until we understand what we're dealing with. Premature disclosure would be irresponsible." The general leaned forward. "Dr. Hughes, you were inside the zone. You witnessed these creatures firsthand. In your assessment, could this phenomenon have defensive applications?" The question hit me like cold water. "Defensive applications? You mean weapons?" "I mean national security," he replied smoothly. "If what you're describing is accurate, we're talking about a technology or natural phenomenon that can potentially transport matter across time. The strategic implications are secondary to the scientific implications," I interrupted. The room tensed at my tone, but I couldn't stop myself. "What we're witnessing is the most significant scientific discovery of our century, possibly in human history. We're talking about living specimens from an extinction event that shaped our planet's entire evolutionary path." I took a breath, trying to regain my composure. "General, I understand national security concerns, but this isn't about weapons. It's about understanding a phenomenon that challenges our fundamental conception of time and biology." Dr. Wainwright cleared his throat. "I think what Dr. Hughes means is exactly what I said," I finished. "My team risked our lives to document this discovery. We didn't do it to create a new arms race." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. I'd overstepped, but I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Finally, Colonel Jennings spoke. "No one is suggesting weaponization at this stage, Dr. Hughes. But surely you understand why all aspects must be considered." I nodded stiffly, not trusting myself to speak further on the subject. The hearing continued for another hour, with questions ranging from the biological specifics of the specimens to the exact dimensions of the fissure. I answered everything I could, occasionally referring to Amelia's more detailed data when necessary. By the time we finished, my voice was hoarse and my back ached from standing. "Thank you for your testimony, Dr. Hughes," Dr. Wainwright said as the session concluded. "The panel will continue deliberations. You'll be notified of any decisions regarding future research access." I gathered my materials, unsure if I'd helped or hurt my case for returning to the site. The military presence on the panel worried me. Science moved by sharing information. The military thrived on keeping it secret. As the room cleared, I noticed Preston Stevens waiting by the door with Amelia beside him. They'd both testified earlier in the day, but I hadn't had a chance to speak with them privately. "Ezra," Preston said, using my first name for perhaps the first time since we'd met. "Walk with us." We moved through the sterile hallways of the facility in silence until we reached a small courtyard. The government complex sprawled around us, all concrete and reflective glass. Security cameras tracked our movement from every corner. "That was quite a performance," Preston said once we were outside. "Not exactly diplomatic." I wasn't trying to be diplomatic. Amelia gave me a sideways glance. "We noticed. Did you expect me to nod along while they talked about weapons applications?" Preston: "No, but there are ways to redirect those conversations without antagonizing half the room." He was right, but I wasn't in the mood to admit it. "Did they give you the same speech about national security?" "They tried," Preston said. "But I have something they want, which puts me in a better negotiating position." "What's that?" "Funding." A thin smile crossed his face. "The Institute has secured private backing for a new expedition. Significant backing. We're positioning it as a scientific assessment mission monitoring from a safe distance. No direct interaction with the emergent landmass." I stared at him. "They're letting us go back?" "With restrictions," Amelia clarified. "Heavy military presence, all findings subject to review before publication. No independent communications during the mission. But we'll be there," Preston added. "Observing, documenting, that's what matters." I wasn't sure how to feel. After the confrontation in the hearing room, I'd assumed my chances of returning to the site were minimal. "Why me?" I asked. "They must have a dozen other researchers they'd consider more cooperative." "Because you've been there," Preston said simply. "You've seen it. And despite your occasional lack of tact, you're the best marine biologist I've ever worked with." Coming from Preston, this was high praise indeed. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen showed Asher Powell's name. "I should take this," I said. "It's Asher." Preston nodded. "We need to finalize staffing by tomorrow. Let me know if you're in." He and Amelia continued down the walkway while I answered the call. "Asher?" "Ezra." His voice came through with excitement that seemed barely contained. "Tell me you're somewhere private." I glanced around. The courtyard was empty except for a few pigeons. "Private enough. What's going on?" "I've been examining the specimens they sent to my lab, the shell fragments specifically, and the DNA analysis came back." There was a pause for effect that was so typically Asher. "Ezra, they're not modern animals that resemble prehistoric species. They're the actual creatures." I sat down on a nearby bench. "Explain." "The genetic material shows none of the evolutionary markers we'd expect to see in modern descendants. No adaptive mutations from the KPG boundary forward. Nothing." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "These creatures didn't evolve into modern forms and then somehow revert. They're the original specimens, preserved or transported somehow." The implications hit me in waves. This wasn't just about an isolated ecosystem of living fossils. If Asher was right, we were dealing with something far more profound, a rupture in time itself. "Are you absolutely certain?" I asked. "I've run the test 3 times. I'd stake my career on it." "Don't say that too loudly," I warned. "They're keeping this tight." "Oh, I know. 2 men in suits are watching me work." Asher chuckled nervously. "They think I don't notice them, but subtlety isn't their strong suit." "Be careful what you share," I said. "This is bigger than either of us realized." "Will you be going back there?" he asked. I looked down at the manila folder Preston had slipped into my hand before walking away. "Classified" was stamped across it in bold red letters. "Yes," I said. "I think I will." "Good. Someone needs to understand what's happening before they try to control it. He paused. Call me when you can. There's more to discuss. The line went dead. I sat in the courtyard, turning the folder over in my hands. Inside were the preliminary plans for the expedition, staffing requirements, equipment lists, research parameters. The first page showed a satellite image of the emerging landmass, already much larger than when I'd last seen the data. I opened the folder and began to read, knowing that somewhere across an expanding stretch of Pacific Ocean, a world from Earth's distant past was breaking the surface after millions of years hidden in darkness.